Bateson's very good at. So that's why I thought of you.
Wonderful. I'll relish watching it soon.
So I guess we're live streaming. Hi, everybody. It's Millennia Microcosm again. We're working our way through Kenneth Smith's column series, which we're collecting into a book, but discussing along the way. And this, for those new to the session, the premise of this book, in a nutshell, is that although we are trained as moderns to believe that we see the world objectively and scientifically and rationally, in fact, more objectively than any people ever in the history of the world before us has seen things, none of this is true. That's a catechism, a doctrine. And in fact, we see the world in very stereotypical ways that if someone from a different epoch were to look at us and study us, they could say, wow, that's such a modern thing to do. Whereas to us, we would think, well, what do you mean modern? No, we're just objective. There is no, stereotypical set of flaws in seeing the world that characterizes modernism. That's not possible because we see everything as it really is. So what Kenneth Smith does to try to help us break out of that trap that we're stuck in, to get us to turn around and see our own minds and how we think and get free of it, is to run us through 3 different epochs of human history and show us how wildly different these 3 worldviews were, to get us to really understand how the ancients looked at the world and how the medievals looked at the world and how they were different from each other and how they were different from us, so that at last we can then turn back around and say, now let's look at how moderns see the world and how many of the things that we took for granted as just common sense or unthinkable, just naturally how things must be, turn out to be distortions that we see through our own warped lenses and funhouse mirrors, just like everybody else did. And that the pattern of those warpages is the signature of our era that establishes what we're going to be able to understand and not understand. The link that I just shared to Nora Bateson's documentary, An Ecology of Mind, explores Gregory Bateson's theories, which also work on the same area, which is how this came up in the last 2 weeks. What does epistemology have to say about the distortions that moderns introduce into the world? And one of the things that he puts his finger on very clearly is that we think the body is a machine and food is fuel. We think the cosmos is a great mechanism and it follows rules and laws, like a machine turning its wheels. And all of our sciences and all of our philosophies and all our political systems and our economy are all geared towards a world in which that is true, which is a problem if that's not true. If that's not how things work, then we're trying to pound everything, into a square hole when it might be a round peg. Phil, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I have a question to ask about that, because so far you laid out 3 modes of thinking. One in which nature is fundamental. It's on top, you could say it that way, or on the bottom, fundamental. And then God, and then man.
The modern.
So this is all, in a way, looking backwards, which I can't object to that in one sense, because all we could do is look backwards, even though we want to look forward.
Yes.
I wonder whether there's not like a 4th structure.
Yes.
That's not one of those 3, you know what I mean? And that's not necessarily a combination of those 3. I mean, so Absolutely. That you can only tell when you get to the 5th level and look back at the 4. I mean, right. So like it really comes down to the metaphor I had, when you're driving, like imagine you don't have a windshield, all you have is a backward mirror, and you're trying to drive forward. I mean, it's very difficult. All the future is always a reflection of the past, so it would even be worse if you have a back mirror and then it's projected to the front windshield, so that you think, oh, this is the future.
Yes.
I mean, which is like, so all you could do in terms of the future, in a way, is that you could learn something from the past, but you kind of have to almost group around to find the 4th era. I mean, the 4 major era. So. So it's kind of stuck in a way.
So I'm glad you brought that up, because that underscores a number of critical issues here. One is, Kenneth Smith is by no means saying that there are only three possible ways of seeing the world, nor is he saying that one of them is right and the other two are wrong. Right? He's not a Hellenophile who says, if only we were all Greeks, let's all return to the Greeks. What he's doing is saying these are the three epochs of at least European history, and of course modernism has made it world history, that are very well documented. And they're documented not just by outsiders looking in, misinterpreting what they see. They're documented from within, including by philosophers who really wrestled with the problems of what is typical of our era, how do we see things and not see things. And so we can get beyond both caricatures and naive self-appraisals with these three epochs to actually begin to see people wrestling with the problem of what do we know or not know, and what is distinctive about our period compared to other periods. It's not at all to say that these are the only three or the best three or anything. In fact, our problem is that the vast majority of ways that people have seen the world have been in oral cultures that never wrote it down. And frequently those cultures, our first encounters with them were colonial and apocalyptic, where rather than documenting how did they see the world, which assuming we were even qualified to do that, we destroyed it as quickly as we could, seeing any deviation from whatever norm we had at the time as evil. So there's been this massive erasure when it comes to documentation of what our various options are for how to see the world. So Kenneth's not trying to be comprehensive, and he's not trying to be prescriptive, except in as much as he's trying to help us develop the tools that will allow us to get some leverage against the traps we build for ourselves in our minds by using these three against each other. And then with those tools, we can go on to explore whatever other worldviews we have access to, and try to make sense of them. So I thank you for bringing those up. That's one of the critical things that I wanted to say about what you said. There's two others and they're much shorter. One of them is Kierkegaard, right? One of my very favorite Kierkegaard quotes is from his 1843 journal, when he says, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. The great irony for anybody who's a prescriptivist who wants to say, I have the answers, you should all listen to me, and I will now tell you what the future holds and how we should live, is that he doesn't know what he's talking about. We can look backwards and see how we got here, but we can't look forwards. We don't know where we're going. And furthermore, as you emphasized, we can, with great effort, come to see the past epochs more clearly than we can understand our own, because our own epoch is the water we swim in. An enormous amount of what's distinctive about it is invisible to us, precisely because we were raised inside it, which means we are less well suited to give an accurate and fair appraisal of our current circumstances than any other people in the history of the world were they to look at our era. If they were to look at our era, all kinds of things would stand out as, whoa, that's strange, or did you know that's really typical of you? Whereas for us, those things would be completely invisible. We'd either assume everybody always did it that way or everybody always should have done it that way.
That's one of the reasons, I guess I've always, to a degree, even though I think of myself as having an intellectual life, I always believe that intuition is an important tool.
Yes.
Because it seems to me intuition is a tool that allows you to feel what's ahead of you, but not encapsulate it as a certainty.
Yes.
Right. So it's all, once again, to get back to the metaphor of the mole, right? It's like, going like this. I mean, so therefore, I think we have undercut intuition quite a bit in our intellectual culture. That
modernity doesn't like it.
Yeah. So that in a sense, it's almost like, well, intuition is where you get these myths, these sort of like magic potions and all that kind of stuff. But that's not really it. I mean, that really is what Beethoven's talking about, you know, that somehow intuition somehow feels the vibes and try to get a sense of harmony. Because I think too many of us listen to music and only listen to the melody.
Yes.
But it's really the harmony that actually brings it to a full body relationship. So that's it. I'll let Peter talk.
Yeah, Peter, your turn. Go ahead.
I'm in regards to Kenneth Smith's model of how he wants to look at history and the appeal or detriment of focusing too much on history and to the detriment of introversion or looking towards the future. I personally think that what he's doing and what many people of the great difficult task of those in the 20th century and beyond in trying to recontextualize the past after such a massive fundamental overhaul of Western orientation with the advent of Darwinism, of anthropology, of archaeology. I mean, this whole moving away from a more, collective in some way Bible literalism of Adam and Eve, it completely shifted thousands of years of different kinds of orientation, or sort of, there was diversity, but still there came to be that different types of consensus. We now don't know how to look at the past. Yeah. Because it's so much more complicated than it ever theoretically could have been in the past. Yes. So Beethoven lived in a more, not to say that he wasn't a deep thinker, but his access to complexity of how to reflect in the past was people didn't have it. Now we have thousands of potential books of all of this information, and knowing how to shift through it and to find not just a workable narrative that's based on accuracy, but one that is applicable and what we can use now. In regards to our orientation to ourselves and community, that actually will help us figure out this runaway freight train that is Western modernism that's, taken over the entire world, how we can get a handle of it and figure out how we can best apply ourselves in relationship to it. And I think Kenneth Smith is trying his best, or tried his best, in order to figure out something that's worthwhile as a conceptual model that is graspable enough for people to make use of.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Everything you just said, I'm right behind you. One of the themes that we talk about in this series is, the Hegelian concept that there are two completely different basal faculties of the metabolism of the mind, and that modernity is prejudiced in favor of one and against the other. We're very analytical, rational, intellectual, systematic, but we are allergic to feelings, memories, sensations, this kind of what the Greeks called the Gnosis side and of mind. We scapegoat that. We say that's the source of all evils. We say bigotry is an emotionalism, right? People wouldn't be bigots if they weren't so emotional. If we could just all be logical robots and Vulcans, we could make a perfect world and all goodness would follow. And hand in hand with that comes a tendency to approach the future as prescriptivizers, because intellectualism is, as Hegel and Kierkegaard and others explored, is a form of egotism. It's the belief that I can apply my schema to the world and it will fall into line. I can categorize things in ways that please me intellectually, and they will be true because I did it, because I said so, because I like the logic of it. There is this kind of hidden side to intellectual analysis that goes hand in hand with a desire to prescribe in a cartoonish, egotistical, mechanical way. And so what we see as moderns, every time someone says, I'm going to launch a great revolution and I'm going to do the following things, is they lay out their schematic platform in a way that is full of a priori assumptions and unexamined value systems, and is sort of self-blinding to that kind of sensitive, sensing, iterative, responsive quality that we see in living systems. And part of what I'm trying to do here is create a distinction that Kenneth Smith takes for granted a lot. that you can see in almost every sentence he writes once you know to look for it, but is often not visible there, which is he wants to correct our imbalance and get us to respect Gnosis more and to spend less time prescribing and more time developing our sense of taste, to really feel bit by bit how things are going. We had a discussion a few weeks ago about slime molds. And we said, why can slime molds solve a maze so quickly when they have no brain, no nervous system, no muscles, none of the things we think of as prerequisites for a planned, intellectual, systematized life? They have nothing that we think of as useful for noesis, and yet they can solve the damn maze. Not a brain cell to be found anywhere in there. How do they do that? And we see that in nature, there is this alternate form of organization that involves a network effect. And it involves, so that there's a lot of information being shared by a lot of observers. And where there is a incremental, iterative, repetitive cycle of sense, adjust, sense, adjust, sense, adjust, that allows even something as brainless as a bunch of social amoebas to do something really quite intelligent without any of what we think of as the prerequisites for intelligence. There is this cycle of sensing and responding that is capable, without any planning at all, of producing remarkably elaborate designs. We talk about the way that nature, in this incremental, iterative, organic form of organization, is able to raise up things from the most entropic state of just a soup of molecules. It's able to self-organize that all the way up to, multicellular organisms and vast ecologies that cover an entire planet. And it did the whole thing without ever sitting down at a drafting board and drawing up a great design and a manifesto and laying out its logic. None of that was required to make a level of sophisticated organization that, to be perfectly frank, is completely beyond us. With all of our planning and all of our technology and all of our science, we've never managed to make any system as endurable and as well organized as what nature is able to do without any plans or schemas. And so part of what's implicit in this is when Kenneth Smith praises the Greeks, part of what he's praising them for is their naturalism, that they had that sense that nature is predominant over us. And so we need to learn, as anyone who's subject to a pathos, we need to learn to put less emphasis on our egotistical plans and more emphasis on sensing and adapting, learning and responding. And that would shift us out of that entropic, mechanistic approach to the world and more towards that responsive, iterative, organic approach that would allow us to make a better world without ever knowing where we were going in advance. That is, without a manifesto, you can make a better world just by getting out of our heads more and getting more into listening and watching and figuring out how things really are and just making little incremental steps to improve things that accumulate over time, the way that nature does things. Now, I'm oversimplifying here. It's hard for us to fully grasp the consequences of this kind of shift from mechanistic, literalizing, systematic planning thinking to sensing, responsive, organic, incremental adjustment thinking. But just by looking at the world and then looking at the Challenger blowing up, this is the contrast I like to hold up is the photograph of the Challenger exploding. Despite all those brilliant minds who worked on it, it blew up. All that thinking and design didn't prevent that from happening. But then you look out into your backyard and here are all these plants sensitively adjusting to where the sun is and where the rain is and where the water is and where each other are. And they're generating this sustainable, complex system. And it tells us that there is this big gap in our understanding of how the mind can work, how societies can work, and so forth. Sharon, then Phil, then Ginny. Go ahead, Sharon.
First, I have an observation and then a question. So as Kenneth Smith tries to help us understand what has gone on in the epochs, the ancient, the medievals, and try to give insights to the moderns. One of the things that I am noticing is how the moderns just repeat the history that's gone on before. And I don't know if you've talked about this already, but I read an article in the New York Times yesterday written by a history professor from Berlin, and it's called The Return of the West. And it talks about, it digs in history and draws the analogies to where we are today, with Russia marching into Ukraine and the pretext with which they went. And it's probably not any different from the ones the ancients and the medievals used. So yes, we're getting all this light thrown on our past behavior, but are we so incapacitated that we cannot change it?
Right.
That's the question I have.
Right. Right. Well, you know, this is, so there's a couple of pieces to the answer to that. And of course, the answer is mostly going to be questions, but one piece of the answer is, it's very hard for moderns. It's very easy for moderns to talk about human nature and to say this is what people are like, but it's very hard for us to do so accurately, because we assume that either everybody in the past was like us, and that's how we normalize ourselves and attempt to deny that there's any programming going on in us, or we say everybody in the past was a primitive version of us, and that history is a great linear march of progress that leads from those benighted, stupid, superstitious people up to glorious, objective, enlightened us. And both of these are two sides of the same coin. Mm-hmm. And they conspire together. As we flip back and forth unconsciously between these modes, they conspire together to make it hard for us to understand why people in the past did the things that they did, right? We assume that they either did it for the same reasons we would do it, or they did it for a defective version of the same reasons that we would do it. But they couldn't have done it for a reason that's genuinely different, but also good, coherent, that it, you know, a viable alternative to ourselves, because we don't believe in viable alternatives to ourselves. We think we're the culmination and end of history. So when we look at people going to war now, and we look at people going to war in the past, we see a pattern to it, certainly. And there's a lot of the same rhetoric deployed. But what we don't understand is, what did that rhetoric mean to them versus what did it mean to us? You know, when the popes in the High Middle Ages began calling for the Crusades to go back and retake Jerusalem from the infidels, you know, we assume that their reasons for doing that must be pretty similar to our reasons for doing that, or again, a superstitious version of our reasons. But we can't imagine that they had their own reasons that were almost incomprehensible to us, because we don't think that way anymore. We don't value that way anymore.
We do, though.
Well, we value, but we value in a modernist way instead of in a medievalist way. In the medievalist way, everything comes from God. Everything is centered around God and oriented towards God. God is the source of all meaning and all priorities. And if we fail to align ourselves with God, we're fundamentally failing as human beings. Whereas in the modernist perspective, it is precisely as human beings that we must make these decisions. The modernist argument is that religions all disagree with each other and they can't come to any consensus. And after all, we tried for 1,000 years to follow God's teachings and it didn't really work. We discovered that human beings can corrupt any supposedly divine institution. And so as a result, we don't trust other people to tell us what God wants us to do. So we are not going to go to war because God tells us, or because we think God tells us. We're going to go to war for modernist reasons, right? If you were Putin, Vladimir Putin, and you're looking at whether or not to go to war in the Ukraine, the kinds of reasoning you're doing have more to do with the recent history of the Soviet Union, the breakup into Russia, the expansion of NATO, looking at your own a situation the US is going to later be replicating, God help us all, in a few decades, where you've got a giant powerful military, but a lot of other parts of your society are falling apart. And so since that's the hammer you've got, you look at every problem as needing to be solved with that hammer. There is this trade-off game that modern nation states play, where they're looking at dwindling reserves of petroleum and how do I maximize return on investment so that later on I've got more cards to play with in order, to negotiate with the other nations. He's looking at his reserves of petroleum. He's looking at access to the Black Sea, and he's trying to make these kinds of calculations. He doesn't pretend he's doing it because God said so.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't, even beyond the pretense, he doesn't believe he's doing it because God said so. And the reason that whether or not he believes in God, that's not his logic for doing it. And the reason he doesn't try to sell the war that way is because he knows most Russians don't either. Even if they believe, they wouldn't use that belief as a justification for engaging in war with Ukraine. But when Innocent III is calling for, a crusade way back when, in the High Middle Ages, that is precisely the way that he argues it. And he's not just doing so cynically. I mean, this is before the really rotten age of the late Middle Ages. This is the High Middle Ages. He is a man of a level of faith that we can't rise to anymore. We don't live in a faith-based world the way that he did. He thinks everything is God's design. Literally everything that's happening is part of a great schema. And he himself has a role to play as a servant of God to help bring about God's plan. And the reason for going back to Jerusalem, sure, maybe as a side effect, a convenient, a convergent side effect, he might, there's benefits for Europe and for the church economically and politically to get into Jerusalem. But the fundamental argument, the case for it, for him, has to do with God and what is holy and what is sacred, and the great struggle between two different interpretations of God, his and the Muslim interpretation. So there are going to be, part of what that means is, even when the broad pattern repeats from one epoch to another,
Mm-hmm.
the filigree of fine details won't repeat. And part of the reason that the filigree of fine details of the things that happen doesn't repeat is that they're organizing themselves around a different principle, even when you're doing the same thing.
Yes.
I guess that's what I want to get to. There's a repetition, but also a differentiation because of that.
So what I marveled at is that the ideology is a little different, but the outcome is all the same.
Yes.
Yes. And the ideology has a pretext which may or may not be representative of the actual situation.
That's right. Yeah, it's part of our great challenge in life is that, people who wield power do the things they do because of how they see the world and how they believe the world is, but their understanding of the world and themselves is flawed.
Mm-hmm.
And so a certain percentage of what they're doing is prudent and realistic, to use modernist value judgments, but a certain percentage of it is not, and they don't know it. And a certain percentage of the imprudent things that they do because of this mismatch between the way we think the world is and the way it actually is, some of that other people as observers can see and say, well, that was imprudent. But other parts we can't see because we share the same modernist worldview. And so we're trapped within the same culture envelope.
Yes.
It's part of what's fascinating about reading people's critiques of Putin and what he's doing is which parts do they notice that he doesn't notice, but which parts do they not notice that he doesn't notice, because neither of us can notice because we're all moderns together and we're all sharing the same blindness on those topics. So it's complicated. This is why epistemology is not easy, is that there's these layers and layers of misunderstanding and interpretation going on. But thank you for bringing that up. Phil, and then Ginny, then Stephen. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I think your comment leads me to this little blurb in the text.
Yes, please.
I'll quote the text first and then have my opinion of it.
Yes.
I quote, "A civilization has its impact not by the real artifacts of engineering, I also mean architecture, but by the idealities, implicit forms of understanding and values.
Yes.
And I kind
That
of
governs the mind of the subjects.
I kind of take exception to that in this sense, because they're both architectural forms. The thing is, for instance, if you're kind of like, I hate to say ignorant, but as less educated with the forces of invisibility,
Yes.
then the way the power would be is to construct architecture and avenues and engineering and bridges, and constitutions and legal forms, which gets at idealities, as both a hard and soft structure that reflects the values of your epoch to remain in control.
Yes.
And so therefore, if you cannot see the invisible within the visible, then you're ruled by the visible. And so therefore, you think you're doing what you want to do, but you in fact are living in a maze that control you. I think that relates also to ideas as set in institution, as well as hard structures, such as churches and roads and avenues and all that kind of stuff, or internet structures.
Yes.
And I think therefore you have to actually teach people to understand the subtext that's beneath the text. You want to call all these structures or the text, but there's a subtext, which I prefer to call, in this case, a pretext that is set in. And therefore, as in a sense, you have to be able to, I guess, equivocate between the text and the subtext and check out the difference between the two. And that once again, that leads me back to, like, I like to stand, at the city wall between the outside and the inside, because that's the only way you could kind of juxtapose those two things and see the real meaning of the difference. And I actually think, and I'll bring up art in this case. I think one of the things that Cubism did, in a sense, was to, educate the eyes to see the contradictions within the picture structure,
right,
by clashing different ideas that may or may not have anything to do with each other.
Yeah.
So that you have to get into, first of all, understanding the falsity of the surface structure or the text, and see that there is a third thing that's produced between the juxtaposition of two things together. So 1 and 2 makes actually 3. Well, actually it does make 3, but I'm not talking about the mathematics.
Right.
A third that's born out of it, like the father and the mother borns a child, and the child is a different thing. And so therefore, in a sense, it's the invisibleness within the gap, and one of the things that Chinese thought, at least deep Chinese thought, I'm sure the surface people don't get into that, it's a relationship between the positive and negative space itself. So you see in Chinese paintings a lot of empty space, which is left over for the gap to pour out possibilities of thought. And I think this allows you to transcend that narrative of the surface structure and see what's underneath the narrative. And I think that's one of the things. Now, I would call that in almost a postmodern way of leading you in. Unfortunately, it got frozen out by Montreal, which got back to the forms. And so
Yes.
in many ways, but in some sense, I think that's what made it so exciting, at least in the early part of the 20th century, when people say, hey, there's a whole nother way of looking and seeing things.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
possible, that emerges, which in some sense goes back almost to Aristotle. The truth is something that emerges from your experience. I mean, it's so there is an interaction between the thing itself and you that produces this emergence of possibilities, of the real, the truth. It's really the relationship between the subject and the object. And I think this is a hard thing to teach people because, like I said, you listen to the narrative.
Yeah, yeah.
And you got pulled along by the narrative, and you believe the narrative, but there's always a reason behind it.
I'm going to share my screen just for a sec to show a picture. Let's see, here we go. Speaking of the use of positive and negative space in Asian art, this is an art print by Toshi Yoshida called Cherry Blossoms. And I've been looking at this for the last couple of days, really thinking about the way the empty space that makes up half of this picture is what makes it so special. So at first, you look at it and you're like, well, that's nice, or it's pleasantly arranged. But the empty space makes you think about sitting under the tree or walking under the tree, or all the times in your life when you passed through a tree space and there were branches and birds above you and trunks beside you. If it were a wall of foliage, right, we would observe it from a distance and we would only relate to it, in that sort of distanced way. But because there is that space that in our life we have gone into over and over and over, you look at this and it's very hard not to think about sitting down there with a little sack lunch and a book, with your back against the tree, or walking underneath it hand in hand with somebody. It draws you in, that positive negative thing. And so, this underscores the way in which the establishment of a relationship between the subject and the viewer that pulls the viewer into the experience creates a very different kind of art. And in China and Japan, and I think Korea and some other traditions from Asia, they knew that and were very conscious about doing it on purpose. It has a name. In Christopher Alexander's book, From the Nature of Order, the first one in the series, The Phenomena of Life, this void, the void, is one of his 15 fundamental patterns of living systems. And so he says one of the things that brings certain kinds of Asian art especially to life is the use of the void to create this relationship, to attract you and pull you in. That's relevant to me, for today's discussion also because Nora Bateson, partially a little bit in this documentary, but more in some essays and books she's done since then, talks about the way that part of the way that we mistake the world as being a mechanism made up of parts is that we think of things as existing on their own in isolation, as a legitimate state. And she says, when you look in nature, nothing came into existence that way, literally nothing. All the things that came into existence did so in the context of a relationship with other things in which they were very sensitive and constantly responding to the changes in the things around them. And so she says, we need a new word, which she coins, I think, semathesy, which is something that exists because it developed within a relationship with other things. And the nature of it, its own qualities, derive from that learning relationship. That's what caused the acts of creation. And she says that needs to be a core concept for any epistemology, for any ontology, for any realistic, genuinely realistic understanding of our place in the world. We need a core concept and a core term that means what it is to exist because you developed within learning relationships. because that's the nature of all living things. So this goes,
let me continue to respond to what you said in a way, because it's important.
Sure.
I mean, that was the problem at the very beginning with Parmenides, right?
Yeah.
With the concept of being is, therefore,
That's
not
right.
being is not, therefore it does not exist. So
That's
therefore
right.
you have being, which is an object. There's no void because it cannot be. It cannot move, it cannot be. And so that was untenable. And that's why Western philosophy, starting with Plato and onward, developed the dialectic to make that something possible other than just there's a thing, that's it. No more to talk about. Nothing can move. There can't be empty space, nothing. And so I think the void is, even the way now contemporary science sees the void as not a vacuum, but as a potentiality. It's still things of being. But in Eastern thinking, the void is an invitation to be in it, to participate, which is different from, let's say, oh, it's actually full of stuff that's so small we can't see it, but it's actually a force. And I think that's a different relationship. Okay, I'll end there. Sorry to cut in on you guys, but I was continuing my comment.
Thank you. And I see that Sharon also wants to jump in. So
because can I just be pragmatic here?
Yes, and then Stephen and Peter.
It's going to be two sentences. So Phil, I belong to a photographic club, and last month's contest was negative space. And one of the things the photographer taught us was the support and meaning of negative space. It's not empty. It has definition, even if it's not discernible. And the magic of negative space is its ability to be interpreted by you, the individual.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. I'm going to call on Stephen and
thank you for that.
But there's a lot of work going on right now in education theory, contrasting programmed curricula in which teachers download data into students' minds and then test their memorization, which is the norm now, right? In the US, that's by law. No student left behind means you will memorize all this crap and then get tested on it. And if you don't pass correctly, then blah, blah, blah. And a lot of people are noticing the way that it reduces intelligence. Intelligence and creativity don't arise from those settings. They arise from settings in which children are given a void and toys of some form, whether physical or not physical, that they can then play with and explore and experiment with. Because in that mode, they're not following a mindless program. They have to figure out for themselves what to do next. And they do it by trying little experiments and learning from the experiment, and then either continuing it or backing up and trying a different direction. And that process of being very sensitive to the consequences and responding to them freely is the process of learning that all living systems go through to develop themselves. The void, as you say, Sharon, invites us in. It is an active participant in permitting us to grow and develop in an organic fashion.
The Montessori system, Montessori educational system.
Yes. And part of why we don't see that is that we as moderns are subject to the law of the excluded middle. So we assume a void is an absolute void in which there's nothing ever. And so we're like, how can you learn anything from nothing? It's like, no, it is the void between real things that develop in relationship to each other freely. So anyway, we'll come back to this. Stephen, then Peter, and then Sharon again. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I was just going to point out, we can watch just how spirit or thought has transitioned.
Yes.
Within, my own lifetime. When I'm only a mere 61 years old, but when I was a kid, even the politicians still referred to the legacy of Christianity. Now, this was an element, that the Christian vision was you entertained material wealth enough to live a Christian life. Your purpose was to try and live a meaningful existence in terms of God, was to maintain your moral values and your loyalties, and to die a good death as well. That was all there was to it. There was still this legacy in the thought of all the politicians. They'd been brought up on that. But that was thrown out the window. Suddenly, you know, Christianity in any form was yesterday. And then came the 1980s, where the symbol became Gordon Gekko. Greed is good. Greed is the new God. Right. Of course, in the modern market, we've got all these retirement savings, so we've involved almost the entire population in investment games in the market. People use the word capitalism. I prefer to use the word the market. And yeah, it's just to see that transition in thought, that where there was this legacy of that world you talked about, the medieval epoch, where they still had a fraction of seeing the world in that ancient vision of one ruled by a benevolent dictator or whatever he was.
Right.
It was still there. There was still a legacy to bang. Oh, that's nonsense. And of course, now the new religion is, if we get the atheists believe, if we get rid of Christianity, if we get rid of that doctrine, which involved thousands of years of understanding of human nature, even though we disagree with some of the principles, we've tossed that out and replaced it with you can do anything you like, and greed is good, and it will work out, will come sunny side up.
That's
no
right.
problem.
That's right.
And human nature is basically good. This is the teaching of humanism. We take away the splinters out of our eyes, and we'll be suddenly all singing Kumbaya and waltzing off into the distance. This is the new faith.
Right.
And it's nonsense.
It is. And, you know, it's, you know, to go back to Sharon's point about the way that the epochs repeat certain patterns, one of the pattern that each epoch repeats is its life cycle. Like the Hegelian take on history is that these are not objects and they're not machines, they're organisms. And like the bud, the blossom, and the fruit, they each unfold from their predecessors while rebelling against and negating their predecessor. And so, you know, of these three epochs, what's fascinating is I think we mentioned this a few months ago. It's only the medieval epoch where we can see the whole arc, because we had the ancient epoch before it, so we know how the medieval epoch began, and we have the modern epoch after it, so we know how the medieval epoch ended. But for the other two epochs, we don't know. We don't know where the ancient epoch began. Well, that was before we were writing things down. And so we can't see its origins as clearly. We can only infer them from the pattern of the later two epochs. And then the same is true about the modern epoch. We don't know how this ends. We can see the ends of the ancient and medieval epochs, but not the end of this one yet. And so there are ways in which we have to do comparison and contrast and try to fit this in. But the patterns that we, to try to project out the missing pieces of information. But the pattern that we can see, which especially is shown in the medieval epoch, because we've got the whole thing, is that it begins as a revolution against and refutation of the previous epoch's value system. Right? We've talked before about how even though no historian can really reliably point to a line, a date and a time and say this was the date that the ancient epoch ended and the medieval began. Different historians have lots of different ways of measuring it. Nevertheless, the revolution is really clear. They knew what they were doing. They were on purpose overthrowing the old value system and inverting the meanings of all of the important words we use to understand the world. But despite it beginning with an act of Hegelian negation, for the first third of the medieval epoch, it really was dependent upon the ancient epoch's worldview to make sense of itself. It saw itself as the rebellion against the corruption of Rome, right? The early medievals held in two hands. On the one case, what did the ancients promise? And on the other hand, how did the ancients fail that promise so that they could justify the medieval revolution? But that meant that they were carrying along an enormous freight of ancient value systems on the ones that they negated and said, well, we're against that now, we don't believe in that. But also the unexamined or not rejected ones that they still carried forward. So they didn't fully understand the extent to which the coherency of the promise of the medieval epoch depended upon this framework of ancient worldview. All the early Christians had the ancient worldview. They were amphibians. They had two worldviews, the one that they grew up in and the one they were trying to reject and replace with a new one. And the new one was more embryonic than they could fully understand. It was really dependent upon the womb of the ancient epoch. But as they grew in,
I might come in here. Another aspect which has changed is like the idea of marriage.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
It's not that long ago, people still thought that marriage was a serious business, one of the most serious businesses of life.
Yes.
And it was a point where you had loyalty, duty were uppermost, and you couldn't get out of it that easily.
Right.
But today, it's just a joke. Within a few decades.
That's because of this that's because of this life cycle. Because as a new epoch gains confidence and power, as it gets to where it's solving most of its own problems, it starts trying to purify itself. It wants to push away the rest of the old order and stand on its own 2 feet. And you can see this in the High Middle Ages, right? The Crusades were an act of confidence. The medieval world, medieval Europe, believed that it no longer had to scrabble for bare minimal existence. They could hatch a grand plan to try to fulfill God's, design on earth, and they could muster all their resources and try to bring it about. And they thought they had a pretty good chance of pulling it off, or they wouldn't have tried to, unite against Islam the way that they tried to do. So during that stage, we've talked about this before, an interesting thing happens. You get a new generation of philosophers and theologians and theoreticians who go through the process of trying to comb out the old stuff and reinterpret the new stuff so that it's more coherent and makes more sense without the womb, that was supporting it this whole time. People start to notice, right? They've had centuries now. They've had time to think and reflect, and they're starting to notice the ways in which the way they got launched was incoherent, and they're trying to clean up their act and become more of a thing unto itself. And so there's this shedding process that goes on during the high period. And of course, as we talked about when we really spent some time on the medieval epoch a couple months ago, the downside of doing this is that the desire to be pure and clean and self-coherent is stronger than the desire to be actually realistically coherent and whole. They don't know the full extent of the dependencies they have on the things that they're scraping away. And what happens during this period of triumph and the high classical age of an epoch is that it is becoming more coherent on the surface in the terms it's thinking about, but it's becoming less coherent and sustainable underneath in its foundations, where it's uprooting itself from things that it doesn't understand how dependent it is upon them.
Could I just wanted to react to what Stephen said earlier about the marriage, how it's become a joke. I have a son who's a millennial, and I have to tell you, he is very serious about marrying this woman that he's been with for quite a while. Yeah. And I'm the one who's saying, are you sure you want to spend all that money on a big wedding and blah, blah, blah? And he'll tell me something like to the effect that, Mom, this wedding is a celebration of our love. And so I want to do it in a big way, in a meaningful way, and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And when I see his relationship with his girlfriend, it's much more solid and dedicated and what's the word? Then my marriage was during my marriage. Yeah. It's interesting. So Stephen, they may be sort of going back. It is really interesting because I know that many of his friends who are millennials have also had certain weddings, and they seem to be taking this marriage business rather seriously.
Okay, you're taking the example of an individual attitude. I was pointing to the mass social attitude and the laws.
Yeah, there's
Years
Laws?
ago, there were laws that enforced
yes,
the marital condition,
yes,
and they've been swept away.
yes.
It's not the case that there were people that didn't take their marriage seriously, or the case in the past of people that did take their marriage seriously. Society as a collective in its legal structure took marriage very seriously. That was my
Right.
point.
Right, right.
Got it.
Well, and
Okay,
what
okay,
this
all right.
discussion is illustrating is the third stage of an epoch, is that as it purifies itself and cleans itself up, the consequence of that is it begins to incur more perfect disasters caused by its own core worldview and ideology that can't be laid at the feet of the old order because we've cleaned all that stuff out. And when you enter that stage, you start to get corruption and inefficiency. You break down into civil wars. You get more intense arguments. This is what ultimately led to the collapse of the medieval era and the rise of the Reformation. And you can see that same thing going on now. We've entered third stage modernism, and there are a lot of ways in which that's evidencing itself. But one way is that, although it's not widely known among boomers, among millennials, there is a counter movement that Ginny's describing, where despite the fact that the law has now made it so that, marriage is not as binding as it used to be, you're getting a rising number of people who are far more serious about marriage than their parents and grandparents were. There's a counter reaction taking place against the consequences of that anything goes era that was, the high point of the 20th century. You get long string 7 marriages in a row, would make the newspapers all the time. And now you're getting a new generation that sort of wants to be more serious about this because they're reacting against what was the highest, purest form of modernism, which is that marriage is just a contract like anything else. Everything's just a contract. Our free wills enter into contracts and dissolve them whenever they want to. That's the purest expression of modernism. And now we've got people pushing back against it, saying, you know what, we tried that and it was a debacle and I don't want to do that. Just like in the late medieval epoch, you had Pico della Mirandola and others responding against the high Middle Ages, going, that was not working for us. And the same thing in late classicism. You got your generations of philosophers who were rebelling against the high classical era. This is you can tell which era we're in.
What has been implied is we don't need laws, that our inherent goodness will overcome the requirement for laws. And there's this movement in society where we'll all just band together and sing Kumbaya and waltz off into the distance. An amazing epoch where they did away with laws. I salute you.
To underscore what Stephen's saying, but frame it a little differently, right, is that moderns, just like medievals failed to understand their debt to the ancients, just like they thought in the first third and that they were all themselves and that they were not carrying this giant unexamined freight of classicism. In the same way, the modern order only really worked for the first 2/3, for the extent to which it was carrying this freight of unexamined medievalisms. These medieval concepts, these medieval value systems that we got from the medieval forms of Christianity were part of what made early and middle modernism work. We didn't think that was true, right? Like any revolutionary epoch, we thought it was the new things we introduced that made it work. But we didn't understand the extent to which our new things only made sense within the matrix of the womb of the old things that we were rebelling against. It's this same cycle that happens in each epoch. And as we strip that stuff away, we are surprised, shocked to discover that the promises that we made as a worldview are beginning to fall flat because we've now pulled out vital systems from the old order that we depended upon, but that we didn't know we depended upon. So that our institutions start to become incoherent and produce results we didn't expect them to produce. So that's what Stephen, putting it another way, that's what Stephen's talking about here, is that at least in Europe and European derived cultures like the United States and Australia, our forms of modernism were incredibly dependent upon medievalism in ways that we didn't understand, that we rejected and pretended that they were not. And then we tried to act as though what we had left when we ripped away all of the medievalisms was going to hold together, but it never was. This never works in any epoch. This is always the stage at which things begin to fall apart, because we've now ripped out vital systems that made the organism work.
We went on to colonize the world in the name of God. But of course, if there was a little bit of juicy stuff we could pick up for ourselves along the way, or that's good with me, God said. Oh, wink, wink.
Yes, yes. Peter, then Sharon, then Phil. Go ahead, Peter.
I just wanted to share some thoughts on void and empty space that I think
Please.
are often missed because of the projection of Western values on the reflection of those ideas.
Yes.
Because I do believe that an intellectually focused outlook abhors ambiguity, mystery, and the vague, and seeks
Yes.
to clarify, define, and make still that which is fundamentally ambiguous.
Yes.
Because it is wrapped with potential. It is that intellectual urge to collapse that potential into a particular form that therefore prevents creativity.
Right.
It is that obsession, that's idea that, well, there must be a fundamental underlay of principles to the universe, and
Yes.
I'm going to figure them out and just package them up and get a hold of them. And once I get that, then everything's going to be fine.
Yes.
I'm going to please God, create utopia, whatever.
Yes.
And I think it's that type of Western obsession that I think of prevents them from actually having any kind of real exploration beyond the sort of conditions of the intellectual of conditioning of logic that they narrow themselves down to. I think it is that empty space in a relationship, say, between subject and object, that if we apply our mind not to focus on how it should be,
Right.
but to merely witness how it currently is.
Yes.
Then we can find the gaps in between the structure, which then allows us to go to a greater depth of the exciting wriggle of the electrons that make up the sheer potential of how it theoretically could be.
Mhm.
And it's therein lies the fundamental intelligence, when the mind is not addicted to ossification.
Right.
And I do believe that in order to actually encourage this, one needs to find the beauty of ambiguity,
Yes.
to not resign to it, but to aesthetically appreciate it in relationship to how the mind plays with it,
Yes.
how the mind looks at clouds and thinks, oh, what could that look like? Not what does it look like, but what
Right.
could it look like?
Right.
And therein
be
lies
right.
that flexibility that
Yes.
shifts the mind's focus, not
Yes.
from the necessary of a concrete reductionism of the head, but down lower into the freeform play of the heart.
Yes.
And to me, that it's that essence that I do think is often missed as we look towards this idea of void and the worship of it, as if it's, as Alan Watts described, mere blankness.
Right. Thank you, Peter. I'm totally with you. And I think Kenneth Smith's with you on this too. It's an underlying theme throughout all of this. I'm struck by, I've been playing Dungeons and Dragons and various games like that since 1976. My wife's big career was she was one of the founders of Wizards of the Coast, which went on to create the game Magic the Gathering, and they ended up making new editions of Dungeons and Dragons and so forth. So this is one of my weird little hobbies is looking at kind of game design theory. And there have been a lot of people who've talked about how, the early versions of Dungeons and Dragons were pretty rough and ready. They were little pamphlets that were typed up, and there were lots of holes and inconsistencies in the rules. And thereafter, all these game companies were striving to make more finished, polished products. They wanted to remove all the ambiguities from the rules, make the systems coherent. Everything should be one clean, logical system. But a curious thing happened. Those games became less fun to play. And they're having a hard time explaining why that should be the case. And what they discovered is that the holes, the ambiguities in the original typed up pamphlets invited the players to creatively solve the problems that they presented, right? It became like playing with Legos or playing with toy soldiers or playing with anything that's not rigidly structured. It drew people in to go, well, how do I think that should work? Or what's a different way that could work? It kind of encouraged a creative relationship to the rules. But when they came out with their more professional products later on, where they locked everything down, then it became very bland because now everybody's doing the same thing. They're all playing exactly the same rules, exactly the same way. The game becomes more like a little machine that you run, and somehow the magic of the early forms of the game was lost. So there's been a movement in the last 20 years in game design theory where they have tried to deliberately reintroduce those kinds of elements into these games so that people can invent parts of the game for themselves and get more creatively engaged. Without the void, we don't feel the juices of life, right? We need that. It's what draws us to expand our attention into an area, is the promise, not just of what's there, but of what's not there and what the relationship between them seems to sing to us as a possibility. Sharon, and then Phil, and then I'll go back to the text.
Well, a few minutes ago, Phil read the first line of a paragraph, and I wanted to continue on that because I think it dovetails with what we're saying. It says, for the ultimate authority of a civilization is rooted in its power to format their ideas and values. The preconceptions and prejudices that drive their thinking ex profundis and are at least thinkable. In any transitional or revolutionary era, it becomes as evident as cultural lag that it is not current actualities that individuals see and think, but the dead weight of formatting assumptions that were long ago conditioned to carry, ideas that in effect they think for them by setting up the frameworks in which they think. And I think that speaks to Stephen's references to marriage, how that whole concept has changed because the formatting has changed. And then the other thing is, if you remember, when Hitler took power, the first thing he did was shut down all the free press and the information was controlled. And it's the same thing Putin just did. So he's formatting a civilization just to think what he wants them to think.
Right.
And so I think this was very significant. Then it led into that quotation by Gilbert Murray, which I hope we get to because I found it very interesting and I didn't understand it.
That's exactly what we're going to talk about next.
Yes. Thank you.
Yes. Yes. That a couple of quick things about that. One is ex profundis. You see how he's italicized that?
Yes.
From the depths, from the abyss, right? From the deep depths. That's what ex profundis is about. And it has a whole bunch of theological history if you read Augustine and Aquinas and other philosophers. But another reference is De Profundis was one of the last works of Oscar Wilde. It was a long extended letter that he wrote in prison before he was convicted. And in it, he takes his time in prison to try to express the inexpressible things that have been driving him throughout his life. He says, how did I end up here? What kind of a person am I? What are the unexamined things, the great freight of unconsciousness that has been driving me all my life that I've never actually sat down and written out clearly in order to not justify myself, but understand myself. De Profundis has some of the most profound writing Oscar Wilde ever did. And it's short, right? It's just a long letter. And it's among Kenneth Smith's favorite works. So anytime you start fooling around in a Kenneth Smith article with words like profundus, there's somewhere in there, you're getting a whisper of theology, you're getting a discussion of the unconscious, and you're also getting a hint of Oscar Wilde. I just wanted to sort of bring that out because it's lurking there. But this other, and the culture lag, when we talked about culture lag, that, what you just quoted, that corresponds exactly to what we were talking about the way that each epoch thinks that it makes sense in its own terms, but actually it's incredibly indebted to the previous epochs and the great unexamined freight of value systems and assumptions that make sense of the new ideas, that give it a framework and a context within which it makes sense.
Could I ask where we are with the text? We're on page 3.
So we're in chapter 3. We're under introduction to the issues, and right now we're doing the quotes. There's a pair of quotes from Black Elk and from Demetrius of Phalaris. The 3 paragraphs that follow that are what we discussed last week, and we're going back through it a little bit here. That 3rd paragraph that begins a civilization has its impact. So cultural lag is such an incredibly important concept and term for understanding how any epoch works. And it is precisely one of the lacunae, one of the missing parts of a civilization's text about itself, because it's part of the nescience. It's been shoved into the background. It's not the way that an epoch wants to understand itself. An epoch wants to understand itself in its own terms, by its new definitions, the things that it's proud of. It doesn't want to say, I'm incoherent without those people who came before, and I'm indebted to things I don't understand. Nobody really wants to proudly wave their flag and say, I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm full of opinions and they're all half-baked and I don't know why any of this works. Nobody thinks that that's how you proudly proclaim a new era. But the truth is, that's what makes eras go, is the dynamism between the new ideas and all the unexamined old ideas that they're carrying along with them, unbeknownst to themselves. And if it weren't for the cultural lag, we couldn't even have a new epoch. If we had to do the thing that Gnosis glorifies, erase the whole chalkboard, begin from scratch and make our bold new design that's exactly the way we want the world to work, we'd all die at once. We understand almost nothing about what it takes to make a civilization go. It's like every critical thing that has to be got right has accumulated over billions of years of evolution. And in human terms, 200 or more thousand years of cultural evolution. That's what makes the modern world possible, right? Not just the handful of new bold ideas that we had, but nobody wants to admit their debt to this enormous cultural lag. They all want to talk about the past in the modern terms. As moderns, we all want to talk about the past as the muck we rise up from, the thing we have to push away, right? The superstitions of the past, the prejudices of the past, any negative term you can think of when you talk about social level transformation, we always follow it with of the past, the hideous, horrible, nasty, primitive, you can just add all the adjectives you want. That's what we scapegoat. So the last people in the world to want to admit their indebtedness to cultural lag is a modern. There actually were epochs that were proud of the past. It's just hard for us to imagine because we're ashamed of the past. We don't want the past to be any part of us. So that's part of what he's doing there with the cultural lag discussion. And the final thing that I wanted to draw attention to out of that is the other italicized phrase in that final sentence. Ideas that in effect think for them.
Yes.
Think for them. One of the most unthinkable things to a modern is the idea that our thoughts are not our own. And that when we're thinking, we are not the actor. We think that the safest, most private, most in control place in the world you can be is your own mind. But Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Hegel and Arendt and Smith, this whole tradition, say, boy, have we got that backwards. That is the place we are the least free, because we are thinking using the tools that were acculturated into us before we knew how to think. Before we could critically evaluate good ideas from bad ideas, we got in place all the ideas that allow us to have ideas at all. So it's all the unexamined stuff at work in us that's thinking for us, using us as a host. when we think that we are being free and freely thinking and making choices. Kenneth Smith comes back to this over and over and over as a theme, this idea that we really need to learn to be skeptical about the contents of our own mind, because the first mistake we made was calling it our own. Hardly any of it is our own. It has our sense, it's familiar, so we assume it's ours. And we're used to thinking as egotists, as intellectuals. So we assume if we possess it, then it is subordinate to us and we're in charge. We think in terms of a master-slave hierarchy when it comes to our own thoughts. But of course, that's cultural lag, and so we don't know that we're thinking, that we don't know we're doing that. But we are doing that. We assume that they belong to us, they're possessions. When the truth is, our mind is an ecosystem, and the ideas in it are organisms, and they respond to each other and adapt and grow. And when we're asleep at night, they're busy forming connections, whether we like it or not. And when we're awake and we're thinking, 90% of what we're doing is unconscious to us. We got this little point of consciousness that's going where we want it to go, but it only goes in places that make sense according to all of the unconscious work that happens to format those paths through our minds. And so in that sense, the ideas really think for us. There's a quote later down from Auden: "We are lived by powers we pretend to understand."
Yes.
And Auden thought, and Smith thinks, that in some ways that is one of the pivotal ironies of what it means to be a modern. We think we're freer than anybody ever was. But we think that because we have the most naive epistemology of any culture we've ever heard of. So we think if a thought is in our mind, it's ours and we possess it, and it's a tool and we pick it up and use it and put it down. And we don't understand that the things we think are tools are actually viruses and powers and organisms, and they mutate, and they also mutate us. And so in effect, we end up acting out other people's ideologies and belief systems without ever knowing we're doing it. But that's jumping ahead a little bit. It's just that it's so relevant to that quote about thinking for them. So thank you for that, Sharon. This is some rich Kenneth Smith epistemology stuff here. Phil, then Peter, then Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, it seemed to me like one of the big problem is the problem of essence, whether that's real or not. And I think Western thinking has always been thinking in terms of a reductive thing where you're going to find the essence. So which leads to the problem of identity and difference, right? Because the difference is not part of the essence. You eliminate that, and you keep paring it down till you get finally to the essence. And a different way of thinking is that the difference is really part of the essence, which requires a kind of external dynamism to unfold. So I think yesterday, or maybe the day before, I was in a short talk about Hegel's God.
Oh, right. Nice.
And Hegel's God is essentially equated with absolute mind.
Yes.
And which means the philosopher could get to the absolute mind, which is the same as like religion gets to the absolute, I guess, being of God. And so they're the same. So philosophy, in some sense, in regard to Hegel, is the mature development of God, of absolute mind, rather than this sort of ambiguous development. And I asked, since Hegel's world depends on the dynamism of movement, is God the end, or is God also in the process of changing? Right?
Yes.
Because that makes a difference between a reductive model that eventually gets to the end point.
Right.
So there is a teleology in
Right.
which, like an acorn is going to get to an oak tree. It's bounded by limits, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if Hegel's God was anything like Anselm's God, then God is not bounded. God is also dynamic and moving.
Yeah.
So that becomes a process in which, even in God, there is a relationship between identity and difference. And so identity and difference really brings up the relationship between being and nothingness in a dynamic way, because the nothingness is what allows the possibility of the manifestation of being
Right.
in beings,
Right.
unpacking itself and unfolding. And I think that the problem with civilization is that it seems to me the explosion of nothingness or difference could cause chaos. I suppose when it explodes outwards, maybe is good, but there's always a danger of an implosion, which destroys the very basis that would produce the dynamism, right? So you could see how a civilization is always guarding the boundaries between an explosion and an implosion, because you don't want to destroy the very thing that makes being in nothingness sustain itself.
Right.
So there has to be a platform of stability to launch the explosion outward to gain greater and greater potentialities into the future. I think it's this mistrust of humanity to be able to handle this explosion of possibilities that it doesn't become an internal implosion that destroys. And I was thinking about, the Chinese civilization, which is interesting. It is one civilization that has seemed to last in a long time, that's gone through several epochs.
Yeah.
And it's still sustaining itself.
Yeah.
And it seems to have sustained itself by a kind of strict control of the population, both in external forms and a kind of mind control that don't allow for certain possibilities. So is modernity faced with this problem? You talk about the teaching system of creativity. Perhaps one of the problems with civilization is you don't want to teach too much creativity of explosion that could turn into destroying the very civilization you're in. So you are brainwashing the people by remaining them in a cage of memorization and mechanical maneuvers. And this is the relationship education between the visible and the invisible, right? So they will come out to be industrial workers that produce the basis for the higher beings.
Yeah.
I'll put that in quotes. Intellectuals to manage the explosions outward, and everybody else just being the supporter, the laborers that sustain the civilization.
Yes.
This seems to be just a distrust of
It is.
humanity in general. And
It
perhaps
is.
humanity, in a sense, actually requires that distrust, because we are, in many ways, not trustworthy. And so I wonder, how do you find that balance between that? It's like, I just think that's, to me, and it's an abuse, but on the other hand, I could see why, particularly in a later part of the civilization, when things are getting more and more explosive, it's going to bring down the very thing that the system wants to sustain itself. So it's going to become more and more authoritarian.
That's typical of the third epoch. Yeah. The third age of any epoch, that's going to happen. And the reason is because it's been too successful. So now enormous numbers of people and organizations have vested interests. And those vested interests make it too expensive to allow for change. They are threatened. They've got too much at stake. They will not allow change to happen, even if that change would be healthy. And eventually, by the end of the late stage, even if their survival depends upon it. Because they can always tell themselves that the possibility that this is all going to collapse because of their actions, that might not be true. I might not be responsible for destroying everything. But, say you're a petroleum executive, if I tell everybody that petroleum is destroying the climate, we're going to be screwed, I will definitely lose money, catastrophically lose money. The end of the world, maybe, maybe not, I'm not sure. But the value system makes the money real and the world less real. And so the conflict of interest resolves in the direction of self-destruction, because the thing that's real to them is actually the thing that's less real. And the thing that's more real and that their survival depends on has become less real to them because of the culture. So
that's why I mean, in a late stage, you depend on the culture of spectacles.
Yeah,
I mean,
but
you
in
can
the
have
early
control
stage,
in certain ways, but spectacles controls the mind.
But in the early stage, this strategy doesn't work at all. Because in the early stage, you're a growing epoch with a growing worldview. You're expanding into a world that's hostile to you, to your worldview. It has the old worldview. And if your people don't have the maximal creativity to solve problems you've never encountered before, which is almost all of them, then you're not going to thrive. And so these epochs go through this transformation of values where they begin having to be creative, or else they never would have launched as a worldview to begin with, but having to end in an ossified state that leads to their own destruction. And I think part of where they get into trouble is, they get into trouble in ways that are characteristic of the epoch. But in the modern worldview, the way we get into trouble is, you could allow people to be maximally creative if they share core principles. If they share core principles, then even though you can't predict what they do, just like you don't know exactly how this acorn is going to grow into an oak, it'll be some kind of oak. And as long as it's some kind of oak, it doesn't matter. Most of its decisions can be whatever it wants them to be. It has oak principles at work. So it can be, instead of a balance or a compromise, you've unhooked the two from each other and made them orthogonal so they can harmonize. So now instead of if they're in balance, when you turn one up to 10, the other one goes down to 1. If you turn that one up to 10, the other one goes down, because it's a seesaw. This is the problem with balances and compromises. They come at each other's expense. But if you unhook them from that and arrange them into a dialectic of forces like Heraclitus or Hegel talks about, then you can turn them both up to 10. Because they aren't coming at each other's expense. They reinforce each other. You follow what I'm saying? And this is the problem of modernity, in a nutshell, is that our core promise was, we don't have to agree on principles. We can have different religions, we can have different languages, we can have different cultures. No, we don't need to agree on anything. We'll just get together and have a discussion and make a decision. We'll have a vote. We'll have a market. We'll have all these means of resolving the differences ad hoc as we go. And it's an article of faith with us that that'll work. But the problem is, if you don't have shared principles, then if you unleash creativity, people are going to go in every which way, including civil war and self-destruction, right? Because you have to have the principle that you're not going to go at each other. So modernity had to ossify more quickly than many other epochs did, because there's no shared principles. And that caused us to get into regimented education pretty early on. It's a necessity for us at a level it wasn't for previous epochs.
Let me mention a funny thing that happened. My internet sort of went down, you froze. And I was wondering whether there was something wrong with my internet, or whether you are in the late stage of ossifying.
I like to think the latter. Thanks, Phil. Peter, then Stephen, then Sharon, then the text.
I would like, if I may, to introduce a little bit of expansion of what Rick said earlier about being skeptical about the identity and implementation of the voices in our heads. Yeah. And I would like to go actually in a more positive direction with that in relationship to it. And if you will, I would like for you to take a deep breath, close your eyes, and imagine that there's a wise old man whispering wisdom into your right ear right now. After he has spoken, I would like for you to imagine in your left ear a matriarch from deep in your past, from your family tree, whispering in your left ear an answer that you hadn't thought before to a problem that you're facing right now. Now, those voices that came into your head, in one sense, of course, they are you. But in another sense, they're still very far removed, probably, from the normal voice you normally have. So it is this ambiguity in regards to what is more of a central voice versus those that can come from the periphery, and the quality of statements, observations, that would normally probably never come from the central voice.
Right.
Because it doesn't matter if it's real or not. It doesn't matter who it is fundamentally. What matters is the fact that those two things that were with you probably were quality.
Yeah.
Quality statements, questions, or intentions that you probably would not have come up with your central voice. And it is so by entertaining, being in conversation with, call them fictional, call them fairies, call them spirits, whatever, it doesn't matter. What matters is the experimentation with the range of the different quality of voices you can invite into your mind.
Right.
That can have loads, near boundless potential for difference in how your nervous system can be stimulated outside of the confines of your chosen identity. This, to me, is what shamanism is.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. The mind, the human mind, can do all kinds of things that the machine model of the mind can't account for. Right? We're not just in that experiment that you just had us do, we're not just replaying two little tapes. We're not just fetching stored pieces of data and supplying them. There's a creative act going on. Something new is being produced. And it reminds me of the way that critiques of modernist models of human memory argue that we don't remember anything. What we do is we perform. And when we remember something, what we're actually doing is role-playing something creatively from our past that we've experienced. And when we role-play it, it's in a new creative way we might be attempting to replicate the past. We might be trying to do something new, but either way, it is an act of performance more than it is an act of computer data retrieval. And that really profoundly changes our understanding, not just of how memory works, but even of who are we, who is the voice in our head, and how many we's are there. I think about, this obsession we have with fear of bacteria and viruses. You can find millions of Americans who believe that the world would be better if we could exterminate all the bacteria and viruses. They do not understand our absolute indebtedness. And they also don't understand how much of themselves is bacteria and archaea and viruses. And if they could exterminate all of that and become perfectly purely themselves, they would promptly die. I mean, maybe they'd linger around for a few days, but they wouldn't be able to digest. Their mood would be all over the place. And, we are a community and an ecosystem more than we are an individual. And that applies to, the part of the Zen critique is that applies to our sense of our own identity just as much as it does to our biology and the cells that make us up. And so Peter's experiment there sort of underscores that there's all this untapped potential of other us's we're sort of carrying around in us, ready to go at any moment, if we could just, stop ignoring it, stop pretending it's not there, stop being so intellectual.
I just want to say one more thing in regards to why we pretend it's not there. I believe now, forgive me, this might be racist, but I think it's a product not of modern culture, but of white culture. The white culture fear of insanity. That I feel that it is definitely part of modernity, but I definitely do think that it's more reinforced in this idea of this kind of British and American stiff upper lip, maintaining of control and objective kind of to do away with the subjective and this idea of hearing voices. Think of this that idea of, oh, what if I hear voices? What will people think of me? What might happen to me? What kind of social ostracism will happen to me in my culture if I admit that? If I admit there are voices in here that are not just one. I think that we are deeply programmed.
Yeah.
I'll say modernity here, in order to not look at this for fear of insanity.
It's that law of the excluded middle that modernity is addicted to, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, either we're sane or we're not sane. Things are either true or false. They're binary. And so we want no truck with the middle ground because it's contaminated with insane, which means we might be crazy. And it's like, if we're crazy, oh my God. All right, Stephen, then Sharon, and then I really do want to get back to the text after this, though. So Sharon, Stephen first.
Yes, I was going to say, one of the issues with the Russian invasion of Ukraine was the water supply for the Crimea. Now, this is a thing. Ukraine has had the attitude since they overthrew the pro-Russian leadership that they can give the finger to Russia.
Yeah.
And if Russia comes, the West is going to back us up and support us.
Right.
But one thing they did when the Russians took Ukraine, they had that trouble in the Donbass, is that they're in a belligerent phase. And they not only cut off the water supply to the Crimea, they filled the canal which took the water. Ukraine filled the canal with concrete. This was a huge finger to Russia. And this is the thing, you don't go up and pull the lion's whiskers.
Yes.
Ukraine was in a position where they had to figure out how we're going to placate this powerful neighbour, preserve our freedom at the same time.
Right.
But I get the feeling that the Ukrainian leadership, this is a thing that's not been, they've been idealised in the West, but you look at this guy that's president at the moment, he's absolutely provincial. He's a guy from virtually a small village as far as world politics goes.
Mm-hmm.
And yet they're praising him as a leader, and nobody's turned around and say, hey, aren't you the guy that got us invaded by Russia? Was there something you could have done different to prevent this? Nobody's asking this question.
Right. Right.
It's the ability, this is our borderline, it's guaranteed by the West, and we can do whatever we like.
Right. Right.
And it was in a very, very provincial attitude.
See, and if you were to interview Americans about that incident involving the water supply, hardly any of them have any idea that ever happened, right? Because the version that people are learning is, well, there's good guys and there's bad guys, and the Ukraine are the good guys and the Russians are the bad guys. And that's why Russia invaded, because they're bad guys. And that's about the sum total of most Americans' understanding of why there's even a war going on. The idea that there could have been provocations going on is like, it contaminates that cartoon version of the story. So, our political and media leaders would prefer we not think about that. And there are parallels to this all over the place. The same was true when we entered World War II because of Pearl Harbor and fought against Japan. The way that we sold that to the public was for no reason other than their evil aggressiveness. And, of course, there was a heavy dose of racism in this because they're evil Japs. For no reason other than that, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. We were minding our own business when out of the blue, we got bombed. Of course, the truth was that the United States was trying to prevent Japan from becoming an empire and had for years been chasing Japan around Asia, hemming them in and stopping their access to rubber, to wood, to water, to steel, to all these things that Japan as an island nation needed access to, the US was hemming them off from to keep them from getting to. We knew perfectly well they were going to attack us for that because it was their entire plan for the future we were messing with. But when it came time to sell it to the public, we just, hid all that. That ability to foreground and background, to take a complex picture and shove into invisibility vast swaths of the picture and leave behind whatever picture we want to make of what's left. This is a variation on the Rorschach test, right? But it's a conscious kind of Rorschach operation where we're hiding enough of reality to create a completely different picture out of what was already present. This is how we normally do politics and how we normally do the media and education. And as a result, as children, unconsciously, we pick it up until we are unconsciously doing it every day, every minute of our lives. Everything we look at, we shove an enormous amount of stuff into the background and invisible it in order to make a picture that pleases our interpretation of the world.
There was the ironic thing that they made this film in 2016 when all this was going on, the after effects of the original thing were going on, and you got this, suddenly they've made this patriotic film of Vladimir I, creating the modern state of Russia. At one point in the film, his biggest campaign is to go and face the Byzantines. This is going to be the ultimate culmination of my power trip here.
Yes.
On to Curzon.
Yeah, it's always the case whenever you dig deeper into any simple explanation of world events that something far more complicated is happening. And some of these things you can see coming. Someday when the United States breaks up, which it will because we don't share common interests across whole stretches of our country, one of the points of conflict, not the first round, but the second round, is going to be that an enormous amount of California's water is shipped out of Oregon. A lot of Oregon's fresh water is taken and piped down to California. And if it wasn't, California wouldn't work as a state, as an agricultural state that's the breadbasket. The idea of making the breadbasket of the United States be a desert and that we would just suck in enough water from another state to fill it in, that only works as long as Oregon's got a lot of rain. But as the climate shifts and Oregon begins to dry out, you're going to get serious conflict between Oregon and California because Oregon's going to say, we need that water now, and we would rather not give it to you. You could see this coming. I don't know if it's 100 years from now or 80 years from now or when it is, but sooner or later, Oregon and California are going to have a big fist fight over the fact that California is taking all of Oregon's water, and then later they're going to need that. These sorts of currents run underneath everything.
Well, California's running out of water now. That's been going on for a while, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Washington and Oregon are getting drier.
And the breadbasket of America is the Mississippi, Missouri.
That's going to move north into Canada.
Agricultural power of America, I'm afraid. Yeah, California is a sideshow in that regard.
Yeah, except for certain kinds of produce.
Fruits.
But, Sharon, almonds. Sharon, and then Phil, and then the text. Go ahead, Sharon. She says, where's my mute button?
Yes. So I got a question. As
Shoot.
We're talking about civilizations, right? Their passages, the different epochs and the time passages. I have a question because I'm fascinated as we read what I see play out in current history, current reality. So my question is, do you think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is setting us up for a clash of civilization, East versus West, different kind of ideology, given the context in which we're discussing now?
Well, what's scary about it is the potential. And I don't think anybody's in a position to say for sure what's going to happen. But what we can say is happening right now is that different sectors of the modern leadership have different opinions about whether a war with Russia would be a good idea. And there's even a fringe group that thinks a nuclear war would be fine too. And they're arguing amongst each other to see whose foreign policy approach is going to prevail. What you see happening right now is that the majority opinion is that it must not become a shooting war between the US and Russia. That if it becomes a shooting war between the US and Russia, we're probably all going to die. And they're serious about this. You can see, you know, if you will see the US public frequently make posts that say things like, why don't we do a no-fly zone over Ukraine to protect our Ukrainian allies? I see posts like this, I don't know, every week. And the people who are posting that don't understand that at the moment, there's a near consensus among our oligarchs that that is the last thing that they want. They want a war. They just don't want nuclear Armageddon. War is profitable, but Armageddon is a disaster. So they're sort of carefully negotiating. And that's why you're seeing all the economic sanctions and all these other approaches, is they're trying to fight an economic war in the hopes that they can avoid a shooting war. But the problem is none of us know whether that's a viable strategy or not. It's just a guess. And we don't know how this is going to come out. Generally speaking, there is a principle at work here that everybody has been ignoring on purpose, which is that you remember just before, in the early Obama administration, the phrase "too big to fail" was raised as a reason why we could not allow banks to collapse after they grossly mismanaged the economy, but we also couldn't punish them. We also had to make sure that not a single banker went to jail. This was Obama's promise at a number of financial meetings during not during the election, but during the campaign. He went to a whole bunch of financial groups and told them, I absolutely promise if you elect me president, none of you will go to jail. And that was how he got the money that he needed to win that election. He got huge support from the banking sector because of the promise that none of them would be punished for their malfeasance. And from everybody else's perspective, although that got him elected, that was a disaster, because the problem in the US for decades now, since the 80s at least, has been this free-for-all approach in which financial institutions prey upon the poor. They screw up the savings and loans, they screw up the mortgages, they screw up anything that they want to. They manufacture disasters, rake in profits, and then buy up all the bankrupt houses and all the bankrupt institutions. This has got to stop. This is starting to look like the late 19th century with the boom-bust cycles. But, you know, too big to fail was the Band-Aid that got put over our anger, right? That said, no, you can't touch them because it would be bad. So what I'm trying to draw out of this by extension is that just like you should never allow a financial institution to become too big to fail, because then it means you can't hold it accountable. The same is true of a nation. No nation should have too much military power to be punishable. When a nation has, for example, a massive arsenal of nuclear weapons, it means that it can misbehave all over the world and nobody dares do anything to stop it. Because if they do a direct confrontation, it could lead to the death of everybody. Mutually assured destruction, right? This fear of mutually assured destruction was used to justify an enormous amount of mischief during the 20th century, not just by Russia, but by us. The things that we did in Vietnam, in Korea, the things that we did in Central and South America, the things that we've done in the Middle East, a lot of this was just deeply wrong. And the only reason we got away with it is nobody could stop us because they're afraid to make us too angry, right? Because we've got nukes. And now the shoe's on the other foot, on purpose. I mean, Putin did this calculation. You could be sure he did, which is he's playing chicken. He's saying, I've got nukes and you all know I have nukes. And you're not sure whether or not I'll use them. So I'm going to do this military engagement and we'll see whether you feel like risking it. And right now the answer is, well, there is a certain amount of conservatism in the oligarchs that makes them not willing to risk it. And so they're trying to win by other ways.
So it's not necessarily a clash of ideology, as it's a clash of let's see who goes first, or if at all.
Yes. Yeah, the thing that is very hard for Americans to understand is how much like Russia we are.
Yes.
The same is true of China. These nations, despite their surface differences and despite their history of differences, have all embraced modernity and modernism. So they're doing Machiavellian realpolitik type calculations just like we are. These are basically different brands of moderns. And so although there is an enormous amount of ideology that's different, and frustratingly so, like the huge anti-gay movement in Russia is a lot more virulent than the very large, nasty anti-gay movement in the United States. It's more virulent in Russia. There are meaningful differences, but they're still just two different brands of moderns. They both believe in money, military, domination. There's a collection of ingredients that make up these nations. Just us, China, the rest of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
That answers. So we're more similar than dissimilar, and there's not so much ideology to fight about because we both have oligarchs in America and in Russia. Yeah. Our oligarchs here just appear more benevolent than those in Russia.
Bye, Peter. Yeah, we have a different brand of oligarchy.
Correct.
Than they do. But that was the Princeton study. Was it about 15 years ago? The Princeton study that evaluated, were we a functioning democracy anymore, and concluded the United States is not. We are an oligarchy.
Not correct.
Generally speaking, large corporations and those with money sooner or later get what they want out of the political system, but individual people who don't have great piles of money more or less never get what they want out of our system. The only things that are working for us mostly are things that were working before that haven't been broken yet, that are still, we've got some lag. It's cultural lag, right? We've got some lag that's working to our advantage from earlier stages of our country. That's not something we really want to admit. It doesn't fit our brand. When we wave the flag, when we run for elections, when we give political speeches, we never say our glorious oligarchy, right? This is off brand for us. And so we don't teach in schools, we don't teach little kids, welcome to America, it's an oligarchy. We don't want to think that way. We want to use other words to describe it. But Nietzsche and plenty of other analysts would say it was always a foregone conclusion, given the core cultural DNA of the modern epoch, that all truly successful modernist nations eventually become oligarchies. Because without a shared set of principles and values, all of our high-minded language sooner or later devolves down into might makes right. Whoever has the most money, whoever can buy the most politicians, who can buy the biggest armies, these are the people who get what they want in the world, because we don't stand for anything else. We pretend to, but they're all sort of empty anti-values. Phil, and then the text.
Yeah, this is a sort of, I don't know if it's a retort or compliment to what Pete was saying.
Why not both?
About hearing other voices.
Yes.
Relationship, identity, and difference.
Yes.
But the corollary to that is one has to be willing, which is difficult, to deconstruct one's own identity.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
And one of my favorite art projects, which is probably not very well known, is when Rauschenberg met de Kooning when he was younger, and well, they were both younger, but de Kooning obviously from a different generation, at Black Mountain College, and they sort of like each other. Black Mountain College at that time, I guess in the late 40s, was a very progressive institution that a lot of new ideas came from. They had at least a familiarity. So one day later, after they met, he went to de Kooning and says that he wanted a drawing from de Kooning. He didn't ask at least for a painting. He asked for a drawing. And of course, he explained why he wanted it. And he says, I wanted it so I could erase it.
Yes, right.
I want to erase it. And so de Kooning, after hearing his explanation, he was going to give him, something else. And he took it back and he went to his drawer and he found another drawing. He says, I want you to have this, so you're going to erase it because I would really miss this one. if we
Right.
erased it. Yeah, right. So
For
that
this
was
to work,
interesting.
it has to be something I care about.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. So Rauschenberg talked about it. He spent hours and with many different erasers and essentially erased it all. In order to even see it, you have to take an X-ray or something to see it.
Wow.
But it anything left. So in some sense, it's a small drawing, but it's one of my favorite to show how generous de Kooning was. Right? I mean, like to say, I want, because you're dear to me, I want to put you aside so I can move ahead. And he agreed, yes, if you need to do that, by all means. Like what an act of generosity.
Yes.
and it's one of my favorite work of art. And I'm sure that I don't know how many people treasure it, but I'm sure that it might have a pretty high value, but probably not as high as his, magnificent painting. So that's it. But nonetheless, I think that's worth knowing that in order to make room for others, you also have to make room, deconstruct yourself and make room in yourself.
Yes.
So other things. So the difference that is possible within you. So I just wanted to mention that in relationship to hearing the voices, but you have to make room to hear the voices.
Yes. That's a really profound art project, I gotta say. And it goes to the heart of the thing that as mortals we least want to acknowledge, which is that death is not a mistake. Death evolved in us, right? The potential to die has been with us for billions of years. We don't know when it developed. As moderns, with a mechanistic entropic idea that the body is a machine, we imagine it was always there, right? That of course things break down because entropy rules the universe, but that's not the case at all. Living systems build up. They could easily, and may in fact have, developed early stages of life on the planet that were more or less immortal, right? They just repaired themselves always, unless they finally suffered some catastrophic breakdown, but that they wouldn't die on their own. That could easily be the case. I remember, there was a stage while I was alive when we still weren't very clear about the life cycles of an awful lot of single-celled organisms. And there was some speculation about whether amoebas were immortal. And there's a Tom Robbins novel, I think Even Cowgirls Get the Blues might be the one, where, he's making an offhand comment about, he's setting the scene. Yeah, and he's making a reference to, for all we know, there could be an amoeba crawling along the arm of some beautiful lady that we're admiring, and that amoeba could have been alive for 2 billion years, and how would we know? We don't even know it's there, let alone, whether or not it can do the thing that we can't do, which is live forever. And it's, when you look at the large-scale geological time evolution of species and domains of life on this planet, you can see that life went through a number of experiments where it would try a strategy until it began to fail. And then all of life all over the planet had to change more or less to try an entirely different approach to the ecosystem. And so an example of that is anaerobic bacteria and archaea. Anaerobic bacteria and archaea can't tolerate the presence of oxygen. And we think of that as a defect, but the truth is oxygen is a very volatile element. It's normal not to be able to chemically handle oxygen. And so it makes sense that the early life on this planet, might generate oxygen as a byproduct to be gotten rid of, but it certainly couldn't hang around in an oxygen atmosphere. We had a methane atmosphere for quite a while. But the problem is a successful anaerobic bacteria and archaea ecosystem that spreads all over the planet, releasing oxygen as a byproduct of its normal metabolic processes, is going to poison itself. It's going to create an atmosphere that kills it, right? And so there was a collapse at which, we went through a crisis on this planet, and it drove the evolution of aerobic bacteria and archaea, which turn out to be a blessing, because oxygen has all kinds of potential metabolically if you can overcome the enormous danger that it presents. It's like primates mastering fire was a huge step forward for us. But we could understand why early primates' reaction to fire is, for the love of God, no, get away from me. I don't want to burn to death. And to this day, a certain percentage of us burn down our houses. It's just like, it's where you're playing with fire is what it was like for life on this planet, developing an oxygen-based metabolism. But it had to happen. So when we're talking about, and the same goes for, by the way, I mean, I alluded last week to the idea that after we terraformed the planet by transforming it into an oxygen atmosphere, there was another stage called snowball Earth that we had to overcome, because high oxygen atmospheres release too much heat and the planet gets cold. And so a new stage of development had to occur in ecosystems on the planet where an enormous amount of CO2 could be produced and released in order to balance the oxygen and retain enough heat to avoid the boom bust cycle of,
Okay, please don't say we overcome in relation to the snowball Earth.
Well, we're life, right? I know we don't like to think of ourselves as being allied with archaea and bacteria, but we are. If they hadn't done what they did, we wouldn't exist at all. So my point is, the ecosystem as a whole had to develop new features in order to move forward. And death has to have been one of those features. It has to, because the great advantage of death from an ecological perspective, there's two. One is problems and mistakes eventually get erased, right? No matter how bad the worst tyrant on earth is, you're only going to be stuck with him for about 100 years, maybe less. And then it's over and you can move on, right? And the same is true for a species or for an individual organism. No matter how disruptive it becomes, that disruption will come to an end. That's an enormous advantage. And the other advantage, even if it is the best of all possible organisms and is not disruptive in any way that we can see, merely existing and consuming things is a problem, right? I mean, how many plants and animals have to die so I can live? The answer is a lot. There's a lot of them that have to die. So if we can reproduce and produce more people, but none of them ever die, we will all starve to death. This is just an inevitable consequence. And for this reason, life on this planet evolved death as the solution to the problem. We each only get so long, and then we have to give our resources back to the ecosystem. We have to create the void anew, right? So that new life can grow into it. And, that's not something that as moderns, particularly as moderns, we like at all, right? Our dream is of immortality, whether because medical breakthroughs will solve all problems, or because we will make the perfect AI and upload our consciousness into computers and dwell forever in the utopia of machines, or any of countless, we've got a lot of fantasies about this. These fantasies are what come of over-identifying with Gnosis. Gnosis is an egotistical, individualized schema. And so we can't imagine the world without our individual ego being present to judge it and change it and be in charge for those of us who are real megalomaniacs. But Gnosis can adapt to this. That other faculty that we are prejudiced against has the capacity to understand a larger whole, right? Gnosis is a whole forming function. It creates relationships between us and a larger world that allows us to see ourselves as part of something bigger, and allows us to have a large component of pathos in which, rather than being actors, we are acted upon and are part of a larger thing. And as part of a larger thing, death is not that scary, right? Nature was good to us. It gave us all the things that we have. And so the idea of giving back is not a terrifying problem from a Gnosic perspective. It's only terrifying from a Noetic perspective. So the reason why moderns in particular would be shocked by that exchange, right, between Rauschenberg and de Kooning, And that's part of why it tickles me so much. And I'm so thankful that you mentioned it again. That's a good one. Let's go to the text. I know we're in the final of 3 hours today. And for the first time, we're going to move on to some new text. So let's, I think we can get through this whole thing that I have planned in the 45 minutes. We start with the Gilbert Murray and Max Planck quotes. And these are really important. Okay, now I'm warming up. I got to get out of this thing. Gilbert Murray, 5 Stages of Greek Religion. You know, I have a list from Kenneth Smith, a lifetime reading list, which is a document that he shipped around on his email group, and it starts with a prefatory caution because he was nervous about creating it at all. He said, people will think that I'm saying these are the only books that you should read, or they'll assume these are the most important books that you should read. He says, I can't make either of those claims. I mean, you need an enormous background of additional material to make sense out of even just these books. And he says, I can't tell you these are the most important books. These are just the ones that I've really, really loved the fact that I've read these. They've really challenged me, and I don't see how anybody else could come to these conclusions and ideas unless they read them too. But I'm not saying there aren't better books out there I haven't found yet. So I know he's antsy about me sharing it around, and he's both satisfied and also sad that he created it to begin with, which is the main reason I haven't shared it. But I can allude to it as much as I like because he quotes these things. So I do this to say the Gilbert Murray book that he's quoting here, he has Gilbert Murray at least twice on his lifetime reading list. He says everybody should read the 5 Stages of Greek Religion, and everybody should read The Rise of the Greek Epic. And I've read them both, and I agree with him. They're just essential works. Part of the value of 5 Stages of Greek Religion is that it lets us look at the rise and fall of an entire religion. I mean, other than living history people or neo-pagans, there really aren't any classical Greek religious people around anymore. You know, the people who do it now are sort of trying to simulate what it was, but they don't really know what it was. They're moderns trying to figure it out. The original religion of the Greeks, it rose and it fell, and it was replaced by Christianity, and it's gone. So just as the medieval epoch gives us a unique example of a worldview where we can see it from birth to death, so too the Greek religion lets us see a religion from birth to death, which is something we almost never get to see. And it was documented along the way, including by philosophers and skeptics and theologians and so forth. So it allows us to get some understanding of how religion works that we can't get from studying a lot of other religions. Studying other religions is great and important, but this one has some novel insights. So this quote that he has, that opens this up, is from, I think, the last stage, the loss of what he calls the loss of nerve is the 5th stage of Greek religion. And that's where the Greek religion put a lot of risk and danger and a lot of strong sense of your own mortality and that you're temporary, and that even your culture might be temporary and your religion might be temporary and this whole epoch might be temporary. That sense of all of these things as an organism with a birth and death, and with an enormous amount of responsibility without a safety net. And he argues that part of the reason why the Greeks turned to Christianity was out of despair at the failures that they had set in motion during their golden age. And their very best, all of their best qualities ultimately led them into the series of civil wars, right? That the Peloponnesian War, and then it was followed by Thebes and Corinth and others, you know, successively fighting for dominance, until eventually they were so exhausted the Macedonians could come in and take them over. And he says there was a revitalization under Alexander. The Hellenistic stage, you know, was kind of the 3rd stage where Alexander gave them hope again. Now they're spreading a sort of neo-Greek religion all over the Mediterranean, and they're feeling good about it. But ultimately, they were defeated too, right, by the Romans, like we talked about last week. The Romans eventually did it in the Macedonians. And even the Roman Empire, you know, when, especially when we're getting into the third age of the ancient epoch, and it's getting more and more corrupt. So even while it's succeeding, the members of the Roman Empire are feeling like it's rotting, like it's corrupt. And Gilbert Murray says they began to lose their nerve. They said, the whole promise of our age is just not working and we don't know what to do. He says, starting in the Hellenistic, but getting really strong by the Roman Empire, you see people putting more and more emphasis, less and less emphasis on the early heroic concept of the religion, and more emphasis on the fatalistic side of the religion. They got into astrology. Maybe the stars can tell us whether we're lucky or not, right? We talked about free will and determinism and the idea how you could be born with a bad character, but if you worked it and worked it and worked it, you could develop it over your life into a better character, even than somebody who was born with a better character, right? Who was lazy with it. That notion of personal responsibility and cultivating yourself was core to the original concept. But by the time you get into the Alexandrian and especially into the late Roman era, they're giving up on that. And they're saying, I just want to be lucky. It's too hard. I just want to be born under a lucky star, right? Not a disaster, a bad star. I want to be born under a euaster, a good star. And, you know, maybe astrology will tell me if I lucked out and got a good character. So they're going to fortune tellers, they're going to astrologers, they're going to everything. All this stuff is spreading throughout the culture, this fatalistic sense of let's just see which way the dice fell. And it really set people up to be receptive to the Christian message of, I know it's hard. You don't have to do it all by yourself. Jesus is going to help you. Right? This was the way they proselytized among the ancient Greeks. This was the approach, was you don't have to do it all yourself. We know it's been so hard. You can't save yourself, but you don't have to. Jesus has come along to save us. And to the Greeks at that stage under the Romans, that was like exactly what they needed to hear. So while writing about that fifth part in the 5 stages of Greek religion, he's talking about why did one sect get ahead rather than another. And he says, Harnack, in discussing the comparative success or failure of various early Christian sects, makes the illuminating remark that the main determining cause in each case was not their comparative reasonableness of doctrine, nor their skill in controversy, for they practically never converted one another, but simply the comparative increase or decrease of the birth rate in the respective populations.
It sounds like the slime mold strategy.
Yeah, right. Right. It's disturbing to us as moderns because we want to believe in the marketplace of ideas. We want to believe that the best ideas will rise to the top. We want to think that, you know, especially if we're Christians, we want to think that the dominant form of Christianity that beat out the others must have won because it was the best form. It was a good form, or at least an acceptable form. But here's Gilbert Murray saying that what Harnack says is that's not the case at all. What became the dominant orthodoxy of the medieval era was the form of Christianity that produced the most children. It told women, this was the version that embraces Timothy, and told women that they should not try to be leaders. They should be quiet and do what their men said and have a lot of babies and focus on the home. And as a result, the population of the Orthodox branch of Christianity surged, and they swamped the other smaller branches of Christianity. They could outvote them whenever they got together to have a conclave. The
Amish are going to conquer the world.
Say that again?
The Amish are going to conquer the world, are they?
Well, I mean, this is what happened then. This is not saying anything about what we should do now. This is talking about what happened then. Now we're in an interesting contradiction where having more children could cause enormous problems. But, you know, back then, that was the thing. And so he puts this side by side with the Max Planck quote for a reason. I'm not going to talk about them one at a time. We have to talk about them together. The Max Planck quote is cited in another book that Kenneth Smith likes to quote a lot on the topic of science. which is, he's got two Thomas Kuhn books here. I'm going to put them both, even though one of them is the one we usually talk about. And the famous one is The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. That's the one that contains the quote, the Max Planck quote. I mean, you can read Max Planck's scientific autobiography, but hardly anybody does. But lots of people read Thomas Kuhn's book. And in Thomas Kuhn's book, Max Planck is quoted. And he says, a new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die. And a new generation grows up that is familiar with the new scientific truth. So they take it for granted. This too, in exactly the same way as the Gilbert Murray quote, is extremely disturbing to a modern, because both of these examples argue that the marketplace of ideas doesn't work. The best ideas do not rise to the top. People are not persuaded by persuasive arguments. Or to put it more finely tuned, people are only persuaded by reasonable arguments on things they were disposed to be willing to believe to begin with. For each of us, there are certain core propositions that make up our worldview that we don't want to question. And there's other stuff that's just the fluff, the filler, the details. And we don't mind arguing about the details and being persuaded because they don't challenge anything important. Even if they're really interesting and surprising and we make a big deal about, wow, I really changed my mind on that thing. It'll turn out that that thing was hardly ever, is there a God? Is the world meaningful? All these core propositions, we really don't want any argument on those things. We're not willing to entertain changes of opinion on them because we have too much at stake. We're all busy. We're not willing to upend our whole life and go back to being a child and starting over, rebuilding a new personality. We're not willing to do it. So if it's on anything important, we don't want to be persuaded. It's the explanation for why people double down when they're presented with evidence that they're wrong. Instead of being persuaded, they double down and say, well, I just believe it harder now. Your evidence is wrong. The media is wrong. Science is wrong. Anybody's wrong but me, because I don't want to question this thing. We look at that in the modern world and we say, well, this is just some kind of weird, bizarre, anomalous failure of people to behave in a modern fashion. But what Gilbert Murray and Harnack and Planck and Smith are saying is, no, when it comes to the core propositions of our worldview, this is the normal, almost universal human behavior. And the only people who think they don't work this way are people who've never questioned anything fundamental about themselves. Because if they had, they would have observed that we do not want to be proven wrong about the things that are going to be a whole lot of work for us to integrate into our personality. Stephen and then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, one of the things I keep on pointing out to, say, people who are starting out as students in the tertiary field, and probably it matters before that, but as a tertiary student, you're approaching education for the full time as a full-fledged adult.
Yeah.
And I keep on saying to these people, people have come to view the education system as a conveyor belt, as a sausage machine. I'll just sit on the conveyor belt and, like Henry Ford's car, they'll put things on me and I'll come out as a nice little Ford Model T at the end of the bloody process. And I say, no, don't go there with that attitude. Think outside the box, do your own research, try to excel at what you're trying to do. And above all, try to find the things that you're good at, that you're naturally talented at, and put a mind to pursuing that.
Yes.
And when I tell people that life isn't, in this case, the university is not going to be a place which is going to be a nice little lunch tray with your lunch laid out, your little drink there, and you're just going to breeze along and have a nice little magic carpet ride. And when I tell them it doesn't work like that, the world does not work like that, I get anger.
Yeah, of course.
And the reason I'm pointing out that is, ultimately, the world is not your friend. It's a competitive place. And if you go out to the world and say, make me what you want me to be, you'll end up in chains of some variety or another.
Yes. Yes. There are plenty
Because
of people in
the post-war period, look, you could walk into a job in the post-war period for a few decades.
Right.
And it was pretty okay.
Yeah.
The world is not an okay. We've come to the world that the hippies created. The biggest egocentric, materialistic, greedy world that you can imagine is the product of kumbaya. 1960s kumbaya, the revolution will come and we'll all be happy. And the very same people became the most hardened materialists the world could ever possibly conceive of. But this is the thing, I tell people, look, think for yourself. Don't go into a situation thinking the other people there are always going to work it out for you.
Right.
You have to see and think what is going on. But
right.
Tell them that. If you tell them you're not going to get your hot chocolate with marshmallows on top and their little faces are waiting for it, I say, you're not going to get that. Don't expect that to come along. I get ferocious anger.
Yeah. Well, you're challenging the
they
core
understand that, Stephen, do they understand that better when you dance as you describe it?
Dance. Yeah. Yeah, there's a, the theme that you can see emerging here with these two quotes, what he's going to talk about in these next 3 paragraphs is the core problem of epistemology. Epistemology is a multi-syllable word that most people can't define to begin with. And even if they can define it, they don't think of it as relevant to themselves. It's something you might have to study in order to get a philosophy degree or an A in a philosophy class, but it's not of any actual intrinsic importance. This is most moderns' relationship to epistemology. And the problem is that how we know things, what we know, whether we know things, what the problems are in our knowing. In other words, how this thing works is a fundamental problem for human existence, right? I mean, in kindergarten, they teach you how to dance a little bit and sing a little bit and clap your hands a little bit and wiggle your fingers, because if you don't know how any of this works, you're not going to thrive very well in life. But what we don't teach is how this works, which later in life is responsible for a far higher percentage of the problems that we experience in life. The way that people's minds works and the way that they don't know how their minds work is the source of, well, Gregory Bateson is in Nora Bateson's documentary. He says most of the major problems we face in the late 20th century are caused by the difference between how we think and how the world works. How could the problem be that universal? Because we universally don't teach people the basics of how this works. We lock it up as an esoteric philosophical discipline, or we lock it up as a esoteric medical discipline, neuroanatomy, neurophysiology. We shuffle it into specialties. You have to get, upper degrees in order to even approach. And even then, most people come out of both of those programs not having an understanding of the basics of how we form opinions and how we deal with new evidence, all of which are critically important things to making a better world. I mean, if we can't ever get people to be comfortable changing their minds in the face of new evidence, what the hell? I mean, really, that is the promise of modernism, that we can pull that off. Democracy doesn't make sense if people don't work that way. Capitalism doesn't make sense if people don't work that way. Really, all of the institutions of modernism only make sense if people change their minds in the face of new evidence. If they optimize their behavior, right, to secure the blessings of liberty or to maximize the good of the whole, or even just their own good. But if they're not actually seeing how things are and they're resistant to seeing how things are, then all of these theories collapse. This is part of why I say, Russia, China, America are different brands of modernism. They're not actually fundamentally different ideologies, because they're all based on they all depend upon this same model of the human animal and how it thinks. And if that model collapses, the rationalization for all of them collapses, which is how you know they're the same species of culture. Phil and then Donald. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, this seems to be a paradox of what the sentence I brought up, because he said it's not built on the architecture of engineering, the hard objects.
Yeah.
This seems to say is something else that in fact is population. So it's a good thing that he believes in the complexities and contradictions.
Yes.
Otherwise, it would be like a complete contradiction. But in other words, in some ways, you could say Donald Trump has got it right. The wall is the thing to keep the identity of the king, which he presumed he is. Because if you could control the influx, then you could control the number of people who's going to vote, right? So it's actually not the ideas. Built the damn wall. Built the damn southern wall because we would control this. Built the structures that will control the machinery of counting votes and casting votes, because that is actually the thing that's going to control the structure, the ideas, not the ideas themselves. So I guess put it to the wisdom of Donald Trump. If you want to put it that way, right? The wall is the thing to catch the conscience of the king.
Well, everybody sees some piece of the problem. Everybody sees some piece of the problem. Our perspectives are all aspectival, and some people as a result, some people emphasize different parts of the problem. They distort it in different ways. I've been thinking about how would you boil down epistemology to something you could teach a kindergartner?
Yeah.
If we wanted to make a better world, what about a world in which everybody understands the difficulties of the human mind and learns to have skepticism about their own ideas? How would you go about teaching that? And I thought about optical illusions as being really useful. I thought about, one thing that you see in psychological textbooks and medical textbooks is the idea of the homunculus, where you say, what would you look like if the size of the parts of your body were related to how many nerves they had? And it helps to show you how distorted your perception of your environment is. It's like if you're touching it with your lips or your fingertips, it's really important. But there's other places where, like the soles of your feet, the heel, where if you touch them there, you're hardly aware of it. And a good thing, because otherwise walking on gravel would be torture, right? It's like there's reasons why we're paying attention hard to some things and not at all to others, but it creates this warped field, and you could teach, I think even little kids could learn this idea that we don't see things how they really are. We see them in these warped ways. And then, by first grade, you could start teaching kids, how would you go about correcting for that? In your own life, what can you do to detect all the places where you have these warpages, and how would you fix for that? I don't think these are hard ideas. It's just that we've been so deeply acculturated into modernism that most of the core ideas are unthinkable for us. It challenges too many things to be willing to confront it. We're willing to have other people have distorted views of the world, especially the bad guys, the other political party, whoever they are. They can be stupid and bad, but not us, right? We do that modernist thing. We shift the world into the smarties and the dummies, right? Donald, you had your hand up, and I'm going to call on you, even though you put it down, because we would love to hear from you.
John, it's not better if men get what they want.
Heraclitus.
Quote Rick there, quoting Heraclitus.
Yes.
I was first going to say, but this is a rather older group, but some of you younger people should be very grateful that us boomers invented sex in the 60s. Otherwise, y'all wouldn't be here.
But I mean, enjoyment of sex, but before 60s, sex was done for procreation only. Is that what you're saying, Donald?
I don't. It's just listening to Stephen. I just that thought just hit me that from a certain perspective, everything started in the 60s, you know, and the thousands of years before that counted for nothing. Very modern, helps us be the most modern generation.
Yes.
The other, there is one thing as we talk about this persuasion and being persuaded that separates some of, to me, it's a distinctive feature of Kenneth's writing.
Yes.
Is that in modern logic, two of the fallacies that you commonly run across or see enumerated are the appeal to authority and ad hominem.
Yes.
And for Kenneth, well, what would there be better to appeal to than a true authority?
Right.
Somebody who really knows what they're talking about and has developed that deep understanding of a subject. So he constantly does it. And the other is for dealing with a lot of shallow modern thinkers is why worry about what they're saying? They can't be saying anything at all because they're the kind of slavish or, you know, sort of instrumental, I'll say banality, instrumental trying to mentality that can't produce truth.
Right.
And so just attack the man and be done with it. You know?
Right. Right.
You know, and this, to tell you, I thought about this for, it seems like decades reading Kenneth.
Yes, me too.
Wait a minute. This is not a fair argument. He is not doing it. But I mean, I think we're going to see this in the next few pages a lot. And as I look through this, it just seemed like it was about time to bring it up explicitly, that many of the traditional, and I would say to add to somewhat the books he said, he's told me, he says, if you want to know about how men's minds work, read Aristotle's Rhetoric. Of course, I never have read Aristotle's Rhetoric, but it's what are the levers that a mind exposes that can be grabbed and manipulated. And that shows you how they work. And the other here, we've talked a little bit before. I want to say, I thought this was very good. We've talked a little bit before, maybe a ways back, about how our mortality shapes our values and our ethics.
Yes.
That we can do stuff that can get us killed. From the Greeks onward.
Yes.
You know, and now we're in a society, modernity, where there's nothing, you shouldn't do nothing is worth doing that would get you killed.
Right.
Whereas the Greeks and the medievals, there were things where your death was obligated. I mean, actually for the Greeks, how do you know a certain person may have a slavish personality? Well, they let you enslave them. No free man would allow that. You couldn't enslave his corpse, but he would fight you to the death, his death, if that's what it took. But, you know, but now seeing this second societal or civilizational beneficial behavior of death is a new layer on top of that.
Yeah.
And I think that's very important. And also let's don't forget that first mortality thing and how it shapes our values and ethics. That's enough.
Thank you, Donald. This is good stuff. There's so much to talk about there. I'm gonna not do it justice because we need to, I want to get us as much through these next 3 paragraphs as I can. But I do want to at least reinforce 2 things that Donald pointed out. The fallacies, right? It is universally recognized among moderns who are interested in logic that appeal to authority and ad hominem are both fallacies. Neither is a legitimate argument, right? You can find little stickers to put on your website or to post in a discussion thread if somebody doesn't appeal to authority or an ad hominem, to say, haha, you didn't appeal to authority, so you're wrong. Or haha, you did an ad hominem, so you're wrong. It's considered ipso facto proof of bad faith. And yet, Kenneth argues, so here we have a group of people. If I wanted to understand what it's like to be an anesthesiologist, would I be better spouting off my own opinions or asking Sharon? Why is it better to ask Sharon? Because Sharon is an authority on anesthesiology and the life of an anesthesiologist, having actually lived it, which I have never done, right? If I wanted to get, the truth about what it's like to be an actor in a film, should I shoot off my mouth or should I ask Ginny? Because Ginny is an actual authority, having actually lived the life of an actor who acts in films. You can do that for all of us. But moderns are taught that authority is bad. What's good is a long logical discussion in which we rationally decide what the truth is. So here we have a group composed of 11 people, only one of whom actually knows what it's like to act in a film. So what we'll do is we'll have a debate and then we'll vote on it. And whatever we decide, that's what life is actually like to be an actor in a film, regardless of whether it's true. That's the truth that we're going to act according to, because that's the value system of democracy. Because under democracy, you must not appeal to authority. Ginny's obvious superiority over us in this area is to be discounted right off the bat as irrelevant because she's an authority and you don't appeal to those. We instead insist that
and actor more so than anesthesiologist. I just want to let you know that. Actors would be dismissed a lot more quickly than an anesthesiologist.
Right. But it's true for all of our areas of expertise. Whatever it is that we're good at, according to modern value systems, we are not allowed to act as an authority on that because that is illogical. It is not a valid logical argument. It must be discounted. And instead, we should have a big debate, and whoever can win over the most people. For example, I could pay you all to have my opinion. And then I win the election, and therefore I'm right. That is legitimate democracy according to the modern value system. But what's not legitimate is for Sharon to tell us the truth about what it's like to be an anesthesiologist. That is not legitimate. That's an appeal to authority, and we're not having any of that. So I would just want to emphasize the extent to which we all have heard, right, that appeal to authority is bad logic. And yet when you look at it, even look at it a little bit, you can see it's insane to consider that not valid. It's insane. Why would I ask anybody other than an authority, right? An authority is the person who knows that thing. It's only the things about which there is no authority or where the authority is corrupt and therefore not an actual authority that we ought to have a debate and discussion about it. The way we organize the development of medical software is people who actually worked in the lab write the lab software. People who actually worked in anesthesiology write the anesthesiology software. Why do we do that? Because they're the authorities. It leads to better software that does what you actually want. But there you can get medical software on the market that was developed by think tanks and groups and programmers. That software is dangerous because those people didn't know what they were doing when they designed it. They didn't know what was important. They didn't live that life. They didn't have any authority. Exactly the same argument can be made about ad hominem. And we all know it, but let's underscore it, right? Donald's point here is really important. This is one of Kenneth's core points. And it goes like this. Let's say somebody is the PR spokesman for Union Diebold, right? Their job is to make the company look good. And meanwhile, in Bhopal, India, they just killed a whole bunch of people. And we can call it an accident, but the truth is they've been cutting corners for years to make more profits. So sooner or later, it was inevitable they were going to kill someone. They thought it would be fewer people and that they could handle it as a minor matter. They didn't know it was going to kill quite so many people and end up in the news. These things happen. Cost of doing business, right? So we're going to have a discussion about whether or not what happened in Bhopal, India was avoidable. Should you give the spokesman of Union Diebold the same level of trust that you give somebody living, say, in Bhopal, India, or that you give medical or engineering experts, from other fields who don't have a vested financial interest? Well, according to the rules of logic, you have to treat the spokesman's opinion as every bit as valid, even though everything he says, we all know in advance, is going to be to attempt to minimize the amount of money that Union Diebold has to pay for the disaster that they've caused. Even though we know that, that's considered illogical to take into account. We must pretend that every statement could be an objective, logical argument that must be evaluated on its merits. And if you don't do that, it's bad logic. It's ad hominem. Not allowed to do ad hominem. To extend the case to where Kenneth uses it, the same is true of human character types. If someone is obsessed with money, they're going to give certain kinds of answers. If someone is obsessed with their own personal pleasure, they're going to give certain kinds of answers. If someone craves social climbing and will say whatever they have to say to make you happy, to make you like them, they're going to give certain kinds of answers. And if we pretend that none of that's happening, what are we saying about understanding of human nature? We're saying people don't have personalities, they don't have distortions, they don't have warps. Of course they do. Ad hominem, although treated as a crime in logic, is actually a prerequisite for having any kind of intelligent discussion. If you don't bring ad hominem into it, if you don't pay attention to who people are and what their motives are, then you're going to waste your time treating as legitimate discussion what actually is a whole bunch of PR, spin doctoring, advertising, legal ass covering, and so forth. It pollutes the public discourse to avoid ad hominem, and it pollutes the public discourse to avoid appeals to authority. Both of those things used properly actually make it possible to have an intelligent discourse. In the absence of both of them, what you get are flame wars among trolls on discussion lists on the internet. The internet is the apotheosis of the modern value system in which you're not allowed to deal with who people actually are, and you're not allowed to give authorities any more respect than people who have no idea what they're talking about. Now, obviously, there's distorted forms of both of these, but the important thing about this is how interesting it is the way that modernity has turned these important values on their heads to turn them into sins. So that the very things you most should be doing in order to have an intelligent discussion are the things you are banned from doing. Instead, we just follow the process of debate and discussion, and whatever comes out the other side, we call it the truth, no matter how insane it is. Garbage in, garbage out, like I said last week. This is the problem. Mm-hmm. Stephen, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just going to bring in something a little bit different. I was looking at Tertullian's against Marcion. Now, Marcion was they call him a Gnostic, was the guy who decided that the God of the Old Testament was a just but tyrannical God.
Yes. And
that Jesus was actually the representative of a higher God, yes, which was really the Christian principle. And you've introduced me to this language of Aristos, yes, Benalzoi, is it?
Mm-hmm. The Aristos, the Benausos, and the Doulos.
Well, of course, you read Tertullian and he's just castigating about Marcion's views. You just got to read the document, the way
so bad.
The ad hominem attacks he made on Marcion. Yes. But I suddenly realized what Marcion was saying is that the God that created you, who they called the demiurge or right, the architect, was a Benalzoi.
Yes.
And the true Aristos God is one way above that one. The God you're worshipping in the Bible is a Benalzoi. No wonder people like Tertullian went insane with the anger at that thought.
Yes, yes.
But this idea that the God who created the world is a lesser God, they call the demiurge or the architect.
Yes.
Just everybody's not going to vibe with that. We're creating a new world here, man, Marcion, and you're messing it up.
Yeah. Yeah. Marcion is one of the most important figures of the early church to study, to understand the nature of what became medieval Christianity, because if people had followed Marcion, the medieval epoch would have been completely different. He was, the one of the great flaws in the theology of the medieval epoch is they never were able to satisfactorily answer the question of the problem of evil. How could God be all-knowing, all-powerful, all good, and yet there be evil in the world? And the medievals never had an answer for that. Their answers were always really flaky.
Well, Tertullian's claim that if you over-occupy yourself that question, you're a bit of a sickie.
Right. He said, in other words, don't ask. Right? That was how he tried to patch it over. He said, you're a bad person if you ask this question. And the reason was because we can't answer it. Our theology is broken. So along comes Marcion and he says, wait, I've got an answer. The good God didn't make this world. It was a sort of semi-idiot craftsman who made this world, and he screwed up a bunch of things. And the good God came along later and gave us Jesus and said, look, we got to help you guys out because that guy made a mess. It's not the good God's fault that the world has bad things in it because he didn't make the world. Marcion comes up with a solution, and here's all these early Christians going, well, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, that explains an enormous number of things, right? You could come out of that loving Jesus and loving God and feeling like this all makes some sense, and there's, it's logically coherent. But Tertullian was having none of it because he recognized that this is the Achilles heel of their theology. And, his answer was, if you ask that, you're bad, and Marcion's bad, and you all should shut up or we'll burn you at the stake, right? That's my answer. My answer is shut up. Stop talking about this problem. And to this day, as a result, there are still sects of Christianity that still use the medieval recipe and have a problem. They have exactly the same problem Marcion pointed out. What was it, about 110, 120 CE? He starts writing about this stuff, points out the problem and his solution. And here we are almost 2,000 years later, and the problem is still around for some people.
Well, there's anathemized in 144 AD.
Yes. So, but yes, ad hominem. And so, from Tertullian's perspective, his vituperation was right on target. He was right that Marcion was a serious threat to the emerging orthodoxy. He was absolutely right. He was 100% correct. Marcion stood for the things that Tertullian did not. It's just unfortunate the wrong guy won that particular debate. Donald, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, Plato in the Timaeus, also the God that makes the world, is a demiurge. And the better translations or glosses always say that's an apprentice. It's never a master craftsman.
Right.
So it's always just, you got the guy from down the street who'd had a little experience at working under someone as a master,
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly the theory. And that's got to be where Marcion got it. And Marcion was classically educated. He knew his Plato. He almost certainly just lifted that right out of Plato and applied it to the Old Testament. But the reason why the orthodoxy could not let Marcion win more than any other reason was because they wanted to come up with a unified theology that would allow all the disagreeing sects to join together and become Christianity. And that included an enormous collection of a very Hebrew sects of Christianity who cherished the Old Testament. They did not want to hear Tertullian did not want to hear Marcion's message that we could discount the Old Testament because that was all about, the apprentice God, and we should only focus on the New Testament. That was what Marcion argued. And Tertullian recognized that if Marcion's position prevailed, there would be a schism, a permanent schism in Christianity. And the Jewish Christians would never again have anything to do with the non-Jewish Gentile Christians. So that was why he fought the problem the way that he did and created the theology that he did. So thank you for bringing that up. I shared the link to Marcion in the chat. He's a really interesting character. I guess we will do the following 3 paragraphs next week. And we just did the Murray and Planck quotes this week, but I had a lot of fun, so I hope you guys enjoyed it too.
Yeah, of course, we loved listening to you, Rick. Thank you.
The 3 paragraphs beginning with,
certainly most humans are never educated to understand how to educate themselves. Right after the Max Planck quote.
A very quick question for David. This is just a technical question. I'm curious. I don't know if David is